And then again, one of my favorite lines in that is anything that's not listed here, you can't teach as part of this. You cannot teach. Absolutely can't take negative action against the teacher. Teachers could lose employment based on failure to comply with what's in state law. You can't have somebody not following the law in charge of our kids. Like we just can't do that.
Hey, welcome out to God and Country. We have another great guest with us today. This is Stephanie Gricius coming up from Utah County. She's a congresswoman in the Utah legislature, and we got a lot to talk about today. Today we're going to start off with kind of a little bit about how you grew up, where you got your morals and values from, and then we'll kind of get into your campaign, your original campaign, and how you got into it. So kind of tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah, so I spent the bulk of my upbringing in the Phoenix area. We kind of bounced around a couple areas within the Gilbert-Chandler community down in Arizona. A very religious community, so grew up very strongly in the LDS faith. My political person has always been my grandma, though. She is the most political person I've ever met, and we joke that she's the only conservative in the state of Oregon. Which is where I was actually born before we moved to Arizona. And growing up, my parents followed politics, but they never really dug into state. But we would have the presidential results up on the TV on election day. But it really was grandma that's always been like, well, and this, and taxes this, and social policies this.
Why do you think that is? What was her background that made her more attuned to that?
I think that's just been her. I think it's just something that has interested her.
I'm impressed.
And it's kind of fun. So she was always my political person. Grandpa probably couldn't tell you what a political party was. So it's just been grandma. But yeah, so that's kind of where some of my foundation with politics comes from, is her. And even still, I'll call grandma and be like, guess what happened today? Or she'll call me, hey, I saw you guys did this. Like, tell me about this, this, and this. And still kind of my political partner in crime.
I love that. I love that you still have grandma, for one,
yes.
And two, that you have that connection between the two of you.
Yeah, it's fun.
A little jealous.
How old is grandma now?
She would kill me if I told you. So we're going to keep that one to myself.
That's funny. So you grew up baking down in Phoenix. Mm-hmm. I don't admire anybody that figures out how to live down there, because it's just way, way, way too hot for me down there. So when did you guys come up to Utah then?
So I came up to Utah in 2006 and then married a local boy and never left. So
all your family's still down there then?
So my dad's side of the family's down there. My mom's side of the family's up in Oregon. And so my parents ended up coming to Utah because it was kind of right in the middle. So we could go either direction about the same amount of time, and there's less baking involved, as you pointed out, but there's also not gray, overcast rain every single day of the year.
It's true, but Oregon's so beautiful.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah, those are two very, very distinct, different climates.
Yes,
Oregon
they are.
from Phoenix.
They absolutely are.
One is lush as green and rain all the time, and you get down to Phoenix and it is just dirt and sagebrush. And
it's actually, if you go in the spring when things are blooming, it's gorgeous, and the desert's a lot greener than you'd think it was, but it's still dry. Still very dry.
That's what makes you a great blend.
Right in the middle. Here I am in Utah, right in the middle.
And it's a different kind of heat down there, too, because I've been down to hot like Houston in the south, and then I go to Phoenix, and it's just so dry. It feels like your skin just burns so much faster.
Yeah, it's a dry heat. So I actually lived in Georgia for 4 years as a child, between the ages of 4 and 8.
Nice.
So
and
I know
humid.
the humidity and the heat also. And Arizona was much better for doing your hair because you didn't have the humidity messing that up. But it is dry, but it doesn't necessarily feel as hot because you're not in a sauna.
You know, I just came back from Cancun last night, and my skin felt easily 20, 30 years younger. And you get home last night, and we're in bed, and I'm like, everything's starting to itch in my back. And I go, is my skin just going?
All the moisture getting sucked out of it.
Yes, it's terrible.
Yeah.
Well, how did you get into politics?
So I actually started in politics as a protester. Fun fact. So when the prison was being relocated, Eagle Mountain and Saratoga Springs were 3 out of the 5 finalist sites. And I started the opposition group out in that area, and it was a royal pain in the rear end for former Speaker Wilson, who was head of that committee at the time. And I took that, channeled it into a city council run. I was the highest vote getter out of 14 candidates for city council, and ended up serving there for 4 years, and then felt like I had done my duty to the community. I was done after that. So I didn't seek re-election, and a couple years go by and redistricting occurred, and my house district at the time split in half, and I was on the other side. And so I ran for that open seat, and here I am.
Wow. Pretty quick then. And how did you first start getting into the campaign and fundraising and getting the word out? How did that all develop?
So I've been a delegate for a long time. And so for me, it was the caucus convention system as a candidate to kind of work through that process. And because I'd been a delegate, I kind of knew, okay, here's how you campaign. Here's how you do it within that system. And so that was fairly easy to kind of get up and going. And in those races, you don't need a lot of money. But I have since learned how to ask people for donations, and it's uncomfortable
It's the
sometimes.
worst part, huh?
Yes, it is.
Did you have any mentors or anybody that was already in office that was like-minded that kind of helped you?
Yeah, so when I was watching redistricting, I actually had Representative Jeff Moss reaching out, Representative Corey Malloy, Senator Jake Andrig at the time, and several others who I had known just from serving on the city council. When I was on that council, I was engaged with what was going on at the state. I spent time at the Capitol every year. And so I had a lot of those relationships put together kind of ahead of time. And so I could call somebody and be like, all right, what did I break? How do I fix it? Why is this not working? And so there were a lot of different people that I leaned on as part of that process.
Well, that's the big benefit behind the caucus system, is because it doesn't take a lot of money out of it. And that's what we've been saying on here this whole time, is the only way to have a good, fair election is to have the caucus system, because it takes the money out of it. When you're a candidate and you just go in front of other delegates and just go to the meet and greets at the libraries, at the schools, and just talk to people, they can hone down on what your principles are, what your values are, what you stand for, and you don't have to put a lot of money into it, because then it's just about you as the candidate and not about how much money can I put together, how much popularity can I get, how many TV commercials can I put on TV. And it makes the candidacy honest. Whereas if you just throw a whole bunch of money at it, then it's just like whoever's got the most name recognition tends to be the one put into office.
Yeah, and that's the ideal, and I think that happens a lot. You also have to be a little bit careful too, because sometimes when you have people that have been around the system a long time, the delegates who are their friends already know who they're voting for going in. So I think one thing that I would advise is, if you are serving as a delegate, go get to know every candidate, because your friend may not be the best option in that race. I know in my race, there were 2 other gentlemen. One was my first race. One was a former representative who knew a lot of people and knew a lot of the delegates going into it. And a lot of them started off supporting him because they knew him, they knew what to expect, and they knew me, but less politically as far as partisan politics, because council's nonpartisan. And I actually had to go and pick them off, and I was successful in doing so, but it took me a lot more work to get into some of those living rooms to talk to these people, because they're like, oh yeah, we already know him, we already know he's fine, like things are great. And so to go in and convince kind of from behind. So just make sure you talk to all of the candidates, because I think
really
you'll get
point.
better outcomes if you do give everybody
I get
the same.
frustrated in our community. My particular community, it's the older, the grandparents and the older, more established people that like, well, so-and-so, he's lived here in the community for this many years. We know him. We worship with him. I'm like, that's great. Does he represent the party and the principles of the party? Does he represent the platform and understand the Constitution? Yeah.
Yep, and we saw that, and I was successful in obviously picking them off, or I wouldn't be sitting in this seat today with you guys. And I ended up clearing that 60% threshold on the first round of balloting, but it was a ton of work. So, and I was definitely not the front runner to start out with. I had to go and and work that and make sure everybody heard the messaging. But that is one of the benefits, is you can make sure everybody in those delegate races hears the messaging, as long as those delegates are willing to have those conversations. And sometimes you just got to poke a little bit extra.
As long as you can get into the rooms, you can get in front of people, it
Right.
tends to work out.
Right.
If you don't even have the chance to get in front of them, that never happens.
Right.
And that's the difference again between caucus and just a normal primary, right? Normal primary, it's so hard to get in front of people because you'd have to get in front of thousands of people more because it's open up to the general public now and not to just a few chosen individuals.
Yeah, it's a lot. When I ran for city council, I knocked on more than 5,000 doors trying to get my message across the finish line to everybody. It took the entire summer, and again, it paid off. One of my tips is you never let anybody else outwork you in a campaign. You always have to be willing to work the hardest. But that was a lot of work and
I
lot
admire
of
that. I
blood,
really
sweat,
admire
and
you for
tears.
that.
5,000 plus doors was a ton of work.
Were you
And-
married at this time?
Yeah, with little kids.
So did Dad just have to stay back with the kids, or was he able to help with the campaign?
So it's interesting, and this I think is a difference between men and women running for office, is women, and I don't buy into like the sexism thing, right? I don't feel like I've ever been held back as a female, but it is a little bit different. You have to approach things a little bit differently. So people would ask me, you know, who's watching your kids, but they wouldn't ask the men in the race who are the same
Right.
age as me, who also had young children at home.
Right.
So you have to message that and market that just a little bit differently. But fortunately, he was working exclusively from home at the time. And so he was able to hold down the fort. We had 3 at the time. And he took care of all that. We homeschool our kids, so he just stepped right in and took
Sweet.
care of that. But we also, during election day, you know, I had my 2-year-old out holding signs on the street corner for honkin' waves and things like that. And they all came to City Hall when we voted, and they all got the little I voted stickers also from the people working the election. And that was probably the best civics lesson they will ever receive in their entire lives, has been following me on this political journey. They know more about taxes and all sorts of things that most kids don't even think about. And they're teenagers now, but
Yeah, I was going to ask, how old are they now?
15 and then getting ready to turn 13 and 14.
Oh,
So-
junior high and just one in high school?
One in well, the second one is starting high school this coming year. So it's busy in a different way.
Yeah.
And driver's license coming up, I guess.
Oh, we got a permit not too long ago, and we're still working on our feelings surrounding that whole situation.
Going to be a careful driver or a crazy driver?
He's very cautious. He's always been my rule follower, so I'm hopeful. It's the next kid that I'm worried about, honestly.
It's always the second child.
It's the second child.
It's usually the second child of the same sex. It's usually the problem child.
Well, and the problem with the second child is she is me as a child, and so I know exactly what to expect, and it's not going to be fun.
The paybacks.
She's the payback child. Yep, love her to pieces, and she's adorable, but she is my payback child.
Now, I know you're a great shot, but you also have some other talents. Some sort of martial art talent?
I don't. So my son has a black belt.
Was it your son?
Yeah, my son's a black belt in Taekwondo. So I am a longtime Taekwondo mom.
Perfect.
You going out to matches and meets with him and all that kind of stuff? then?
We've done all of that. He's on a little hiatus right now, but he's been talking about, okay, let's go back and start adding some stripes to that black belt. But it was years that I'd sit in Taekwondo 3 to 4 days a week and watch all the things. And he needed a sparring partner when he was younger, but fortunately I could still sit on him. He's 6'2.5" now, so I can't sit on him quite as easily as I
Wow.
used to be able to. But he still lets mom win because he's a good boy. So
It's funny. So you get elected. What was it like walking in on the floor for the first time?
it was surreal. Actually, it was such a cool experience to be in that room as the person who votes. I spent a lot of time sitting with my elected officials on the floor, and in the years preceding that. And so I'd been on the floor, but to actually have my own little badge, my own little pin, and be able to go on there without an escort or a babysitter, as I like to call it, was so neat. And then to have my name on that desk and my own little vote button that only I am allowed to touch was such a cool experience. There's really no feeling like knowing my voice actually matters and what I think actually matters. And it was really, really neat to be in that room for the first time. But also you feel the responsibility that comes with it because you're one of only 75 people voting on all of these issues in the House. And you kind of go, oh, crap, that is a lot. Like it used to just be me flying off the handle or going and doing my thing. And there's the weight of not only your district, but also making sure that the policies that you're working on have a statewide benefit. Because there are some things that could be really positive district specific, but maybe aren't the best for the state as a whole. And so finding that balance and trying to make the best decisions you can for the entire state of Utah while prioritizing your own constituents is a lot of pressure. And I like to think that I've done okay at trying to balance those out, but there's always ways that you could do better.
So what was the first item that you ever voted on?
I don't remember, to be honest with you. That was a couple of years ago, and I don't remember what that first one was. It was probably a suspension of the rules or something.
Oh, right. Just like state
Something
convention.
procedural, yeah. Yeah.
Some procedural.
Did you have any, as a freshman, did you have any other legislators who took you under their wing or who were there for you?
Yeah, so all of my relationships that I'd cultivated over the years played out my first session and really kind of came back around. And so I had a lot of people that were really willing to help. Representative Candace Perucci was assigned to me as a mentor. We're all given a mentor, so we have a point of contact if we need somebody to go talk to. And she's great, but she was in the middle of the school choice bill at that point in time, so she was a little busy. So I would ask her when I needed things, but I also didn't want to hinder and have my questions hinder what she was working on because that was such a huge issue and it was such an important issue for the state of Utah. And so I would just kind of go talk to random other legislators. Representative Lisenby was huge. Representative Moss was was my representative before redistricting. Representative Thurston, whose office was right down the hallway from mine. It was just kind of anybody who was available. I would just go, hey, how do you do this? How do you do that? And you learn really quickly who knows how to take the technical wins, who knows all of the legislative rules, who knows how to utilize those. And so you just kind of start asking everybody in all of the different areas, okay, what's the best way to network this? Or procedurally, I need to make these changes because this is not going well. How do I do this? And so you learn a lot from your colleagues. And nobody ever told me, no, go talk to somebody else. Everybody was great. And I think they really are Team Utah. And so your colleagues want to invest in your success because when you're successful, the state is successful. And so there was a lot, and I probably used half the body that first session with asking various questions. And senators also, while I was the nominee before I even got elected, I went and met with a bunch of senators individually too, because I knew I don't just need to be successful on the House side, I need to be successful on the Senate side too. And so trying to build up those relationships, but again, asking questions. And they were all willing to answer. Thank you.
How are you seated on the floor? Are people seated alphabetically or?
So the majority whip gets to assign seats.
Huh. So do they try to put you in between more seasoned people or no?
No, they typically, we call the front row freshman row. Okay. So you kind of move back as you gain seniority. And so that first year, it was Representative Moss who did the seating chart, and I was right on the front row over on the end, but it was the best seat in the House, in my opinion, because I was right next to the door for the snacks in the bathroom.
Perfect.
And there's really not a whole lot more you can ask for. Snacks in the bathroom.
Wow, did they give you just free snacks and everything just sitting out there?
So we have a little kitchen in the back that helps keep us sane to some degree. So we can go back and grab cheese sticks or cookies or whatever it is. But you hear the freshman 20 or the freshman 30, it's like the session 50 because of how much junk food they feed us. And we have groups that will sponsor like morning breaks or afternoon breaks, and they usually bring food also. So you'll get like little trail mix cups or nothing bundt cakes or whatever it is that day, whatever the groups bring. Oh. So we eat a lot of junk food. But
So-
the sugar keeps us going, though.
So setting up your staff, is it mostly interns, or how was it kind of setting up that initial staff?
So we don't have a staff other than our intern. So we get one intern, and we don't even get to choose our own interns, with the exception of leadership. Leadership gets to kind of pick from the cream of the crop of the interns. But we have state staffers that their whole job is to manage the intern programs. So they get to know us. They send us a survey of things, and we put what's important to us, what we don't care about as much, and just, rank on 1 to 5, how important is this? And then they meet with all of the interns, and they try to make a pairing accordingly. And your first session or two, you share an intern, because we don't have 75 interns. And so the freshmen and some of the sophomores will even end up sharing. But some of that, too, is based on workload and other things. But they try to match you based on personality. And sometimes it works out really, really well. And sometimes it doesn't work out at all. And you just kind of roll with it because they're there for an educational experience. And you hope that they're helpful as part of that educational experience. And you try to coach them and teach them. But really, you're just kind of bringing them along, and we can outsource what we want to them. We can have them do our emails or things like that. I always have mine keep my calendar. So my interns have always done my scheduling for me. And sometimes I've had meetings that I've missed because they haven't made it on the calendar that were scheduled. And other times I've been triple booked for things. So it's just a giant learning experience. But that's, as far as like our personal staff, that's what we have. And we only have our interns during the session. So outside of session, it's just me. You just get me. Now, the House Majority Caucus do have policy staff that can help with specific things. And we've got people that we can use as our points of contact if there are things that come up. But they're for everyone within that majority. And then we have nonpartisan staff also that deal with the entire House of Representatives.
I also understand that there's writers, too, that write the bills. How does that process work?
Yeah, so Utah code is written very differently than just typical legalese. You can be an attorney that's used to arguing and doing technical writing and still not necessarily understand the drafting language that we use for statute. It's like its own unique language. And so we have a set of attorneys where we can open up a bill file, say, these are the things that I want it to do, but it's their job to actually take it and translate it into that Utah code specific legalese. And then we'll go back and forth with them, have lots of conversations. Okay. I think I went through 14 revisions on a bill last year, just with having to go back and forth, making tweaks here and there.
No, that's not what I meant.
Well, it wasn't even, that's not what I meant. That attorney was actually amazing. It was just, hey, he'd reach out and say, hey, you could, based on how this is worded, have an issue with this. Is that important to you? How would you like to close that loophole? And kind of going back and forth. And that bill, I spoke with a drafting attorney in Arizona he had reached out to me about this bill about a month ago. And he said that this is some of the tightest drafting he has ever seen as he has researched this policy across the country. And so like our attorneys are really good, but their whole job is to do what we direct them to do. So they don't set policy on their own. They don't slip things into bills. Their whole job is to go the direction that we have told them to go. And then we sign off on everything before anything comes public, and we'll get stakeholder feedback and work through the process that way. But in addition to the drafting attorney, each bill is also assigned a policy analyst. So we have someone who will dig in and research. So I have a bill this upcoming session on adoption tourism where people come in from out of state. It's kind of adjacent to human trafficking, actually. There are some bad actor agencies who will bring in a bio mom as well as adoptive parents from out of state to utilize our laws to skirt the laws in their own areas. And they also take advantage of our benefits. So they'll put these moms on Medicaid. The state of Utah ends up paying for the delivery. And then they basically just send this mom, who typically will have some sort of mental health issue, just back out onto the street. So there's some issues with that. And so even just today, I have an analyst this afternoon who's meeting with some of the agencies on some facility licensing type things and some Medicaid related things. And so you've got them helping with the research in addition to the work that you do on your own. And you can collaborate. So you kind of have your own little team. And the cool thing is all of the staff are bound by confidentiality. And so I can go and have all of these conversations and be very frank and open about what the policy objectives are. We can talk through those without having to worry about, am I saying this in a way that if it gets back to so-and-so, it's not going to be an issue. Like, you can just really dig in, and the team is there to support you, and they do an amazing job.
Where do they get these attorneys? Are these employed by the state, or are they private attorneys that come in?
They're employed by the state. So they all work for the state, and then they're considered nonpartisan staff. So they work for the Democrats, they work for the Republicans, they work for the House, they work for the Senate. Just kind of depends on where they're assigned. And they do move them around sometimes. They'll change up assignments and things, but they all work for the state directly.
Do you have working with the same individuals all the time, or is it just kind of come and go as to who exactly you're working with?
It depends on the policy area. So they try to assign them out. So we have attorneys that typically will do health and human services related legislation. We have our judiciary specific attorneys. We have our education attorneys, and their job is to be the expert in their section of code. And sometimes when you get a bill that overlaps multiple different areas, they'll bring multiple attorneys in to work on the same to make sure all the code is talking to each other correctly. And so it really depends. And I kind of like to spread out my legislation. I don't want to be the one-trick pony. I want to kind of be able to run policy in all of the different areas successfully. And so I've worked with most, if not all, of the attorneys that we have, just as we kind of work through different policy areas.
So do you remember the first bill you wrote?
My first session, I ran 7 bills. So we passed 5 of them. And I would have to look them up to tell you which ones are which, because I did 14 the next session and 12 this last session.
What are some of the ones you were the most excited about being able to bring to life?
So there have been a couple. So my first session, my hardest bill was making some changes to mental health licensing. There had been some changes previously where they had scaled back supervision hours and some of the timelines, but not all of the code matched up. And so some of the community were using a little workaround to essentially require additional practice time by these providers above and beyond what was required outside of code. And the reason they would do that is because these students have to actually pay for those hours. So they were having to pay for additional hours that were not required based on this loophole. And so we went through and we closed that loophole. So one, we could get more mental health professionals out into the workforce sooner, but also save on some of those educational costs because those were above and beyond what had already been required. They, again, were just using a loophole. And that ended up being the most controversial bill that I ran that session because the people who were doing it were going to lose a lot of money because, again, the students were paying for those hours.
Always comes down to money.
Yes. And
But what were they using as the excuse? They were giving you pushback.
they were saying we were going to have subpar providers in the community. We're like, we're not actually changing what's required. We're just aligning these sections. And we ended up passing it. And guess what? The world hasn't fallen apart. But that one was a lot of work, and there were a lot of people that came out to testify both in opposition and support. So we have some bills that are internally within the legislature very controversial, and we have some that are externally very controversial, and sometimes you get unlucky and you end up with both, which was my most recent session. But that was one of those ones where the legislature, I think, largely understood we're just aligning with what we've already got. But from the public perspective, people really came in spicy and were super upset about some of the changes we were making.
Do you anticipate a lot of pushback on this one you're working on now? Like naively, I think, well, that makes sense. I don't see a problem.
I don't think so. We've got meetings lined up with the people that are actually doing it right. And so we're trying to bring the stakeholders to the table as early as possible, but also getting their feedback on, okay, where are these loopholes? You guys know this industry better than we do. What do we need to tighten up? What would be helpful? And when you're able to bring everyone to the table and collaborate on those policies, you tend to get a lot of the controversy out of the way early. And so by the time you get to the session, which I've got until January, so by the time you get to the session, things are generally pretty smooth and the kinks are pretty ironed out. Now, it's not to say there's not surprises, because we definitely get surprises sometimes. But I think that we can get a lot of that out of the way early. And my most recent session was very controversial. We had the union bill that went through. We had a malpractice bill that went through. And then I think I was like the next 5 most controversial bills of the session by myself after that. So it was a really crazy session for me. And I've decided this next one, we're going to take a little bit of a break. So we're still going to go and make some good substantive changes and hopefully better the state. But we are not going to be nearly as spicy as this last one was. I need some downtime mentally.
So how do you coordinate throughout the year? Because you have a very, very set session. And the rest of the year, I'm assuming you're just talking to a lot of people, doing a lot of research and putting stuff together. So how do you coordinate stuff throughout the year? What's typical schedule like?
So we do our interim meetings. They're 1 to 2 days a month. So those are more formal meetings where we're at the Capitol, we're listening to study items that we've talked about, getting reports back from agencies on things and kind of fleshing out maybe some of the areas we didn't get it quite right, and learning some of the things that we need to tweak in policies we've already implemented. So we do a lot of that, but then outside of that, it's really as much or as little as you want it to be. You could spend all day, every day working on your bills, or you could spend 1 day a year working on your bills. It really just depends on what the individual legislator decides to do and how they decide to do it. But you're pretty much self-management. I do quite a few meetings on my legislation because, again, I like to bring all these stakeholders to the table early and get it all figured out early. And so of my 6 bills, I already have 3 drafted and I have stakeholder feedback on 2. And we're not even close to January yet. But I just want it to be done. And I want the little box to be checked off so that I can go worry about other things with my life. So it depends. But when it comes to those coordinations, like coordinating those meetings and things, this is another area where the attorneys and the policy analysts really can help, because I can say, hey, I need somebody at the tax commission who can talk about this policy area. Can you help me set that up? And they're like, yep, great. Give me some days, and they make it happen. So staff are really, really good about that also. Our staff are probably some of the best in the country, if not the best. They really are.
That's awesome
Well, that's
to hear.
impressive to get that much done that quickly. And it sounds to me like you're probably one of the busier legislators, because I don't know very many people are putting that many bills out.
I try not to be. I need to work on that and have less bills, but I don't know which one of my children to murder. So it's one of those things where, okay, we run too many bills, but it also takes a bill to undo policy. So it's not just that you're adding new regulations or new restrictions. I run deregulation bills every single year, but it still looks like a bill. It still looks like a new law. And so you'd have to realize that even though there's a lot there, some of it's just fine tuning, some of it's actually pulling back on what's been done previously, and some of it is new. I did run some pretty significant new regulations this last session when it came to what mental health services are being provided in a school setting. Mental health in schools was codified back in 2019, but there weren't really any guardrails put into statute. So we went through and did what is the most comprehensive parental rights in mental health through the schools bill in the entire country. And so that was a lot of new regulations, but it was one that put parents back in the driver's seat like it should have been done in the first place. So you could call it new or you could call it a correction. It doesn't really matter, but it's still a bill that ends up not necessarily growing government, but keeping the individual in charge.
In contrast, when I'm doing my homework as a delegate, sometimes you go through and you find a legislator or a senator who's look over the years and I'm like, they don't really introduce much or do much. Oh, and your attendance isn't great either, you know. So good to see somebody who's at least looking at hardworking and more than what the public knows. I get tired of hearing the uneducated or uninformed saying, you know, all politicians are awful and corrupt. They're all bilking us. They all work, just take a paycheck and they do nothing and they make tons of money. Did you know that? You make tons of money.
I actually joke all the time. I'm like, hey, if anybody figures out how to do that, let me know, because I lose money on this job. So I'm clearly doing it wrong.
Well, they've for sure figured it out at the federal level. They all know how to make money up there. Come in with...
There's a difference. The one thing that I really love about Utah is we don't see the federal crazy that exists come down into our state. We're collaborative, even across the aisle. We don't necessarily need to be, but we at least make sure that our Democrats are heard We don't give them what they want necessarily, right? But we at least have everybody in a room. We talk about issues. We talk about them across the aisle. We have a whole spectrum of Republican representatives. And you can find two that probably disagree on every single issue if you looked. But we all, at the end of the day, come together and we're still friends at the end of it. You don't have the negative infighting that you see and hear about at the congressional level. We just don't have that. Utah is somewhere where I know, I'm going to get smacked for saying it, but the governors disagree better. I don't think he came up with that. I think he was just tagging on to what the legislature already tries to do internally. Because we really do great. I was talking to somebody yesterday who was like, oh yeah, so-and-so was speaking really highly of you, and it was a Democrat they were mentioning. And I am not one of our more moderate legislators, and I am fairly far away from being a Democrat. But those personal relationships trump the policy positions, and they should, because we are in the business of people. And if you want to be an effective legislator, you have to maintain those relationships, and you have to understand that if you're going to go off just spewing vitriol about your fellow legislators, you're going to get put in the corner, and that's where you're going to stay.
And sometimes the public's not going to know that because that's not what they like to portray on the evening news. They want to spice it up, make everything look a lot more controversial than it is. That's what a lot of our newspapers are doing. And so I appreciate being able to go directly to my legislators, my city council people, and ask what really happened rather than read an article.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I've run some fairly controversial bills over the years, and I have a colleague across the aisle who I think very, very highly of. But she and I disagree on every single one of these things. And there will be times where she'll say, I need 24 hours. And then I'll see her the next morning. I'll be like, hey, I know it's not 24 hours. I'm going over here. She's like, no, come back and we'll hug it out. And so, but you have to have those relationships. And she and I will talk about some of these controversial bills. And I actually, before I do anything that I know is going to have a personal impact or impact another one of my colleagues personally, I talk to them beforehand and say, hey, I just want you to know this is the policy that I'm working on. Here is why. And we have those conversations before it becomes public. And that way, too, things don't get blown out of proportion after the fact.
I wish we could be more like that within families and the general public and realize that humans are not going to see everything the same.
No.
We're just not. But we should be able to treat each other with dignity and respect, even if we totally disagree with what their value system is.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we at the legislature here in Utah have done really well.
Well, there's a big difference at standing up for your values, because there's certain values and morals that just can't change, shouldn't change ever. But there's a way of standing up for those morals and values and then throwing it at someone's face in such an aggressive, almost mean way. Mm-hmm. You've got to be able to be firm in your beliefs, firm in your standards, and at the same time do it in a way that's principled, friendly, and actually motivates others to respect your opinion or respect your position.
Right.
If you can't earn that respect, not necessarily demand it, but earn that respect, then yeah, you're not going to get much done at all.
Absolutely.
Because everything up there is about relationships. And we had Trevor Lee in here, and he's like, man, if you don't have the relationships with everybody else, you're not going to get anything done. You have to have those relationships.
That's totally correct.
And that comes in from just that respect. And like you were saying, and we're seeing it all across the board, you got Republicans that are ultra conservative, and you got a lot of conservatives that are really, really middle of the road. And
yeah. And you have your more moderate Republicans, and that's okay. You know, everybody's elected to be reflective of their district. The state of Utah does not agree on policy. I know. It's like mind-blowing, right? We're supposed to be this red, solid red, conservative state. The presidential campaigns don't care about us because we're going to vote red no matter what we do. But we have such a huge spectrum. But if you look at the individuals, and one thing that people will do too is they'll attack individual legislators from areas that are not their own. But if you actually look into the demographics, those people are reflective of their own districts. And so you just because they don't align with your values, you shouldn't be going out attacking them, because they are definitely aligned with their district.
Constituents.
And that is what they are supposed to do. That's
Fair.
why they're there. And you see the differences between Salt Lake County, a Salt Lake County Republican and a Utah County Republican are not necessarily the same. But even within Utah County, we have some districts that are more reflective of Salt Lake County than they are my area. You know, my area is one of the reddest districts in the entire state of Utah. And so I can kind of go be a little bit more crazy pushing on the conservative policy, but I also have to remember I have to convince enough of my colleagues to vote for it too. And just because my area is crazy red, and I love it. Like, I say that, like, not as a negative. I love it. I like to call us lovingly the Wild West, and I represent half the carp in Utah Lake, all the tumbleweeds, and the best people in the state of Utah, right? And so I love that. But I can't just go do that and force that down the rest of the state's throat. I have to recognize that my colleagues, even when they vote no on my things, they are representing their constituencies. And sometimes you get kind of caught in the tug of war between the relationship and the constituency because you're like, oh, you're my friend, but my people are going to eat me alive if I support this. It's like, it's okay. You do what you got to do because that's what you're there for. You're there to represent your people. And it's great that we can be friends and enjoy each other and go hang out. But at the end of the day, you're allowed to vote no because it's your job to do what's best for your area.
People. Thanks for reminding us of that. I think we all need to be reminded of that. And then also what you had said earlier about basically the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. But overall, what is best for the state as a whole? We may not win at everything. And we need to do a better job as citizens and delegates to not, we have the factions that if you don't vote exactly how they think you should, suddenly you're labeled and you're put on these blacklists and there's emails going around with faces on them and these people are the bad people. And it's something we should be reminded of.
Yeah, absolutely.
We had Trevor Lee in here, and he was talking about how there's a lot of legislators up there that if they don't get exactly what they want, they're just like, well, just kill the whole thing. You seen a lot of that, or you seen a lot of people that are trying to make some more bridges and kind of take those single hit runs instead of the home run?
I think those people absolutely exist. I think that the majority, though, they'll take the single hits if that's what they get. I mean, we always say don't let perfect be the enemy of better. And so if you can move the needle a little bit in the right direction, you should take the win. So just because it didn't get all the way there, I'd still rather have it be a little bit better than not at all. And I think the majority of the legislature operates that way. There are a lot of people who will try and they'll make changes based on colleague feedback and they'll really work hard. And there are some that say, you know what, I'd rather this be dead than anything different. And those people don't typically get a lot done.
Well, I notice a lot, too, on the Democrat side that they love those little single wins, but they like those little single wins a little more dangerous because they know that the vast majority of the stuff that they're trying to promote is very, very liberal. And even some of their liberal constituents don't necessarily accept everything all at once. So they got to put something in slowly, let that get accepted, let it become normal, let it simmer down, let the controversy back off a little bit, and then they move to the next step. And then they let that simmer down. It's not really taking a base hit like we would say and just kind of taking our wins. It's more like, let's slip something in here that we know is going to be very controversial and just let it ride for a little bit and then slowly slow walk people down to something that's a little more destructive, a little more liberal, and that's what we're seeing a lot up in Oregon that we'll get a little bit later here. But my point is we've seen a lot of move-ins here in Utah. Have you seen the constituency of other officials change much? Have you seen a little more California, a little more Oregon values sneaking in here at all?
So you definitely see those kind of sneak in, but you also, even with our Democrats, we still have 60 Republicans that are looking through those bills. Somebody's going to catch it, and we can have a good conversation about it. We have conservative groups that are constantly talking during session internally, and we kind of keep track. If there's a bill that somebody flags as maybe being problematic, you'll have a whole host of people that are going through line by line and digging into that policy. And so, yes, that absolutely happens, but I think we've been pretty good about catching at least most of it. But our Democrats, some of them are fairly successful. And something that's kind of interesting too is we also kind of like them. I mean, obviously, we wish everybody was a Republican, right? Like, we don't ever have to want to worry about it from the conservative perspective. But a lot of our Democratic colleagues are really, really good people. And a lot of them, not all, but most of them will be really straight with you. Like, hey, I want to do this. How much do you hate it? And like, well, I hate this part. This part doesn't really bother me. And we'll actually have them, they'll go back and they'll change their bills to actually address their Republican colleagues' concerns. And on the flip side, sometimes they have bills that are really good. They'll do some technical cleanup bills with the agencies, which are more procedural than policy. And some of those changes really need to happen. And they come out of the committees from interim, so everybody's kind of aware of the issues. And so we'll take the Democrat that we get along with and have a good relationship over the one that we don't. And so to some degree, even though we challenge them every election cycle because we would love to replace them, we also, some of them, we actually feel kind of bad about it because we really like them as a person. And so some of our Democratic colleagues, too, are really good about working with the Republicans, and some of them have run bills that I would consider conservative. So, I mean, that would hurt them back in their own constituencies, but they do that. And we've also have Democrats who have gone out on a limb to support conservative policy that would not play well in their districts for their re-elections, but they do it because they feel like it's the right thing to do. And so it really comes down to the individual person.
It was my understanding, speaking with Rob Axon, that the only Democrats that are left are in the Salt Lake County area, because the one we had up in Ogden is no longer up there. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're seeing as well?
That is 100%. So we only had one outside of Salt Lake County, and we've kind of re-pushed them in with the election of Representative Coford. They're now all in Salt Lake County, and it's northern Salt Lake County for the most part. Southern Salt Lake County is Republican still.
Yeah, most of it's just downtown. Mm-hmm. Surprises me we don't have any up in Park City Democrats up there, but
no, we don't.
Which is very good. So let's kind of get into some of the first bills that you put together. I'm going to pull up here an article. So Utah lawmakers introduced transgender housing guidelines for state universities, which is just going to be the first of several conversations we have of trying to kind of enforce the Title IX executive order of Donald Trump and trying to get men out of women's sports, get men out of women's bathrooms and everything else, whether they're trying to intrude. Kind of go through how this bill was introduced and what you guys did to get it through.
Yeah, so there are a lot of people who think it's in direct response to the Utah state situation. We've actually had a couple different issues throughout the state. And so it clicked as something we needed to go fix. And Representative Birkeland had typically run point on these issues while she was in the legislature, but with her out, I ended up picking up the slack on these. And so basically what this bill does is it says if you're going to live in student housing in one of our public universities, you either live with the sex that you were assigned at birth in that dormitory, or it created more of a co-ed option where you could live in a single room within a co-ed option. But in order to be assigned that co-ed option, you have to opt in. So you could potentially have a trans woman living with 3 biological women, but all 4 of them would have had to opt into that situation. And so I think you will see some where friends will still kind of get together based on their gender identity. But it just creates that at least a space for them. Because if you have a trans woman who presents very, very female, and some of them do present very, very female, it's also not safe to just stick them in a men's dormitory. There is going to be harassment. We know there's going to be harassment. And so it creates a neutral space where they can belong, they can get their education, they can focus on completing their degree or whatever it is that their university goals are, without having to worry about that from either side. Now, the trans community felt very attacked because we weren't allowing them to be assigned to the dorm that correlated with their gender identity. But it's not fair to biological women or to biological men to have somebody of that opposite sex in their space, there are legitimate privacy concerns, and we know that harassment happens there too. We like to think that it doesn't, but it does. And so by creating that neutral third option, there's a space for everyone and they can hopefully exist peacefully within these universities as all of these students try to figure out their different paths. We know college is a very, very vulnerable time in someone's life. Frequently, it's the first time they've ever lived away from home. And I know for me, when I first went and lived in a dorm, I would not have been happy if there was a biological man living in my dorm room. No matter how female they presented, I would be uncomfortable because with my upbringing and my values, it does not fit. Now, I think that all humans deserve to be treated with respect, but that means all humans, including those who are biological females who present as women, biological men who are men, as well as those who are trying to figure out their path forward in their life.
Again, the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. You can't change everybody's life to help only a 1% of the population. But my first year at college, for some reason, my mom had the idea that if I was in a dorm, it would be a party house and I wouldn't be attending my studies. I don't know. She wanted me in private housing because, so I just feel like I don't understand what the big uproar is because there is plenty of non-dorm housing. There's plenty of private housing where people just live in houses, rent rooms together and stay together. Why is that not an option, or why, if you can't stay in a dorm, find a private place to go.
Well, and it is an option, right? And one thing that was pointed out by the trans community was that nothing in the bill requires universities to create this co-ed option or this gender neutral option, as we were calling it, because not all of our institutions even offer on-campus housing. So some of our smaller ones, it's all private housing, and we did not insert the government into those private contracts. We're letting those private contracts figure themselves out. That's, between two parties, and the government shouldn't be involved in that.
Fair.
But when it's a government institution and it's government-owned housing, we do have the obligation at that point to make sure we take care of people as best we can.
Okay.
Was it very controversial to get this thing through, or did you have a lot of fight on it, or what was it like?
So that one was very externally controversial. I think that I feel pretty comfortable saying we knew where the votes would end up at the end of the day internally on the policy. But there were a lot of people who were really, really upset. They felt like they were being targeted, that their rights were being taken away. And I think we have a little bit of a philosophical disagreement on where one person's rights end and another person's rights begin. And that's okay. We're all entitled to see life through our own perspective. But there were very, very heated committee hearings on this bill. It was probably 2 hours of public comment in the House committee, the majority of it being opposed to the bill coming from the LGBT community. And not every member of that community was respectful. And we also had people on the support side of the bill also not necessarily behaving as respectfully as they could. Again, this is one of those things I would like to think that we can all recognize each other as humans first as we go through and disagree on these policy issues. It doesn't always happen, but I will say during the Senate committee hearing, some of those people who had said some pretty unfortunate things during the House committee came back and apologized. And so even though we were very much at odds, I think that there was at least some of that coming back into the conversation. And I was very careful with my rhetoric to make sure that they knew, I don't hate you. We disagree on this. I think that, there's some challenges here that I don't see the same as you on, but you're still a person, and I still respect you as a child of God and a fellow Utahn, and all of those things that I was raised to believe, even though we have these disagreements. And so I know we were really careful on the legislative side to try to make sure that we showed as much love as possible while, like we had spoken about earlier, remaining firm on what those underlying values are. And I think we did that. My intern is actually, I had a very conservative intern this session, which is not necessarily normal. But she even told me that my bill was actually a little bit progressive because even though it separated the dorms, it still created a space for these individuals to go who maybe didn't quite fit in either of the other spaces. And I was like, you know what? Actually, maybe you're right on that, because it's still recognized that even though we disagree, you do need a safe place to be, no matter what your thoughts and your feelings are, right? Because we don't want anyone's physical safety to ever be jeopardized. And I thought that was kind of funny. I was like, wow, come at me, girl. Like, but I mean, she was right. And it was interesting. And during that process too, I met with Equality Utah. I met with several members of this community, several transgender individuals, and all of the conversations that we had were very respectful. I explained, here's where I'm coming from, here are my concerns. And they explained, here's how this makes me feel, here are my concerns. And we ended the meeting with a hug. You know, we're still people, and we still passed the policy. And they didn't love that, but they at least knew coming out of those meetings that Representative Gricius did not run this bill because she hates us. And
she listened, and we were heard.
And we listened, we were heard. One of the things, they had requested some changes with the dates because they didn't want us to be kicking out students a week before graduation. Like, you know what? That's actually fair, because students are going to university to get their degrees. So we bumped out the date a couple weeks until the end of the school year. Someone's already been in that dorm the entire year. 2 more weeks isn't going to change anything. And so, you know, we made a couple little adjustments in response to some of that. And so this is a space where when you legislate in it, you typically get a lot of threats. So security was on high alert, but I was absolutely thrilled that both sides were able to kind of come together, and we didn't have the same issues that we've seen in the past. So we still managed to get the policy through without creating the explosion that didn't necessarily need to be there.
I'm happy to hear that, because when it was happening, that's, you know, like I said, they like to sensationalize it. And so the wording was always a little bit more sparky.
Yeah.
Well, the news media always likes getting their anchor words that get the ratings, because they're in it for the money themselves, and they have to get the ratings. And so they like getting those comments out of context. And I don't think a lot of them do it on purpose, but they do it in a way that where it spikes those clicks, right?
Yeah.
Clickbait.
Well, and the main comment that was actually repeated or quoted from me in the media related to this bill was something I had said on the House floor. Representative Zahara Hayes talked about her experience being a member of that community on the floor during this debate. And she spoke about the student up at Utah State and the amount of threats that individual was receiving. And that's not okay either, right?
Right.
We don't want to be harassed by them. We don't get to harass them either. That's not okay. And those were my remarks. It was like, it doesn't matter who you are. You do not ever have the right to harass another individual, and kind of went through that. And so in some ways, the media was actually helpful on the messaging, because they pushed that out. And they pushed out that even though I ran this bill, nobody should ever get to be harassed. And so they try to sensationalize, but that doesn't mean you have to give them the soundbite that they're looking for.
Yeah. Well, I don't think bullying belongs anywhere. I don't care if you're transgender, you're gay, lesbian, or you're straight. Bullying doesn't belong anywhere.
Exactly.
And the way I kind of differentiate is you're free to be who you are. And there's nothing I'm going to say about it. I'm not going to prevent you from doing anything. But at the same time, I don't want you being so impositional on forcing me to accept everything about that it starts intruding on my morals and values.
Right.
I'm going to let you be you, and you're just going to have to let me have my morals and values. Means you can't force me to use your gender pronouns. You can't force me to say that you're born lesbian or you're born gay. I think it's gender dysphoria, but again, I'm not going to say anything about you. I'm not going to comment negatively about you. You just do you, and I'll do me. But that's where I draw the lines is I have certain morals and values, and you can't get so pushy on your transgender policies that you're trying to force those onto other people. And I think that's what happens a lot of the time is they get to where they want to impose those so much that not only do you have to accept me as transgender, but you have to accept every single policy we put out. You have to use my pronouns, you have to use this, you have to use that. And that's where they kind of go a little bit too far.
Right, and that's one of the things I love about this bill is it doesn't impact anyone's freedom of expression. You can present, you can identify however you want, but those underlying protections are in place, and there, again, is a space created for those who want to act outside of what we would consider traditional norms.
Well, the other part of that, too, is keeping government out of it as much as possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're not meddling into the private area, you're not meddling into private contracts. Because whether it's the transgender subject or any other subject, the more that government imposes upon the private sector, the worse it gets. So you go to a certain point and say, okay, we're going to create that third-party area, and that's just the limit of the government into your lives. And so anytime you can limit that, I think it comes out better anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And limiting private sector doesn't fit with my small government conservative values. So we didn't go there.
Well, we have a lot of fun happening up in Oregon right now, and you're born up there.
Yep.
How long did you stay up there before you guys moved down to Arizona?
Not very long. I was a baby, so I can't claim it. But we did spend our summers up there every year. Again,
Because Grandma's still up there, right?
Grandma's still up there. So we'd go out and run around. Grandma's got some acreage, so we'd go spend our summers out of the Arizona heat, running around barefoot, pant legs rolled up in the creek, looking for bugs and salamanders and
What a
fish.
great childhood.
All the things, picking the wild blackberries off the side of the road, just eating them. And so anyway, that's
So
how
what-
life grew up. A little
So what
different
is
than
Grandma
city
saying
living.
about the political environment up there right now?
Drives her nuts. Drives her very much nuts.
Is she in city or is she out in the countryside?
She's out in the countryside.
Lucky
So
her.
it's the Lane County Republican office is actually in their little town, but she's even outside of town. So it's a small rural area where you can, if you look really hard through the trees, you can maybe see one of the neighbors' houses, but everyone's on acreage. It's a lot of farms, a lot of cows, a lot of horses. And so it's different than your inner city Oregon politics for sure.
Is she part of the area that's looking to secede to Idaho?
No, she's a little too close to Eugene for that, unfortunately.
She making any comments about that at all?
We haven't talked about it in a while, but I'm sure she'd be all about it.
Maybe we should have piped Grandma into this
I know,
conversation.
we should have brought Grandma in.
I don't know how serious that ever is going to be, but it's been quite the interesting conversation going out there about a lot of them wanting to secede over to Idaho.
No, she's fun. She'll call me when Eugene's doing things, or call me to tell me about some conversation or something dumb that one of their local city council members said, and give me her whole thing, and we'll kind of decompress and have our little therapy session and then wait for the next one.
Well, it's got to be hard. I can only imagine how I feel with the things that happen here in Utah when you know that what's not the greater good for the general public is becoming pushed as a norm. And it's just not fun. It's such a great area to live.
Yeah.
Well, like I was saying, I think that the whole transgender issues, you can just do whatever you want to do. I mean, I don't care. Just do whatever you want to do, but just don't impose that on others. Don't try to force your beliefs onto those of us who are conservatives.
Right.
And then where I really, really draw the line is in kids. I think that's a hard stop, dead no. You can't be imposing any of that on kids. I don't care if your kids or somebody else's kids. You've got to give them room to be kids and grow up and mentally develop and mature before children start making any decisions like that at all.
Children can't make decisions. If I let my kids make decisions on what they thought was best, I think they'd have ice cream for dinner every night. I don't think they'd go to school.
Oh, is that real?
There's a lot of that going on. So we don't trust them with their little day-to-days. We are the ones that set their bedtimes even. We have to remind them to brush their teeth. And so, I love my kids. I like to give them freedom when I can, bring myself to do it as the mom, because I think, it's kind of scary when your kids start to grow up. But we don't trust them with all of those little things. Why would we trust them with something that's so huge and so life-changing? As an adult, you go do whatever you want to do. But I agree with you. Kids are where it stops.
Even teenagers, because I think a lot of people try to find an excuse. Well, they're maturing. They can start making decisions on their own. We had one congressman up there in Oregon that said that, hey, once kids reach 14, 15 years old, that parents have no say as to what those kids do anymore. And he literally came out and we played that a couple of podcasts ago, his actual statement that says, no, you as parents, you can't tell that kid to do what to do anymore. That's their decision. And as a teenager, there's still way too much development going on there. You really have no idea who you are. I told my own kids that once you get out of high school, you're going to think high school is just like this all-important area that all the emotions are going back and forth between your friends. My daughter would come home crying one day because some boy dumped her or something like that. And I'm just like, give yourself not even a year, not even 12 months after high school, and you'll probably not even remember or care about anything that happened in high school.
Yep, I know if I had to go back, there's no way I would relive high school. High school was awful.
Yeah, and I was like, it's not going to even be important to you. And she's like, no, there's no way. My friends are everything to me. Their vision is just not there yet because all they've seen is life as a kid, right? They haven't even experienced the real world. And even those first few years of college, there's still so much maturing that has to be done. There's a huge difference between freshmen in college and once they're starting to get into those postgraduate degrees and just the maturity level and the growth level. And so to have kids even be insinuating that children and even teenagers can be making any type of long-term decisions is really trying to force your ideals on the younger generation and not really do what's in the best interest of the child.
But their argument is if you don't allow them to start transitioning earlier, it's going to be too late, that we need to allow them to decide in elementary school what gender they want to be so that they can take all the hormones and have the surgeries before things develop.
Well, and something interesting there too is when did we start getting rid of tomboys? You know, as a girl, like I said earlier, we were running around barefoot in the countryside trying to catch creepy, gross things that I wouldn't touch now, like if you paid me. Like, that's not my jam. You know, I've got 3 daughters who will go outside and hunt jumping spiders because they're so cute. I mean, they're like, oh, look, this one has blue on it or this one has green on it. And they catch bugs and they like snakes and they love fishing and all of these things that are traditionally male hobbies or male activities, things that little boys do. And I mean, they do them better than a lot of little boys their age. Like, that's just how they've grown up. It's like, yeah, it's what we do. We go rough and tumble. And, you know, in today's society, there are people that say, oh, well, maybe your girls actually are boys. I'm like, no, they're girls. And then I know when I was growing up, I had a little neighbor boy my same age next door. And some days we'd be running around cutting down trees in the backyard and getting in trouble for that. This was in Georgia, so there were a lot of trees. And then other days he was over at my house and we were playing Barbie dolls in the basement.
Yeah.
And that was okay.
And it's a shame that we label kids. I know even in my age, I feel guilty. I think back at the one little boy who liked the arts, you know, so he was in dance and things in elementary school. And so then you start calling them names as a kid innocently. I mean, children aren't doing it out of, you know, anything political other than it's not a traditional thing. And we need to teach that people have a variety of things that they enjoy and it's okay to like dancing and playing the harp when you're a boy. That doesn't mean it makes you a girl. My
son's favorite colors are pink and purple. You know,
I think
some
most
days
boys
it's green,
it's pink and
but
purple.
a lot of it it's pink and purple. Mm-hmm. And that's okay.
Yeah.
My daughters like blue. Also okay. You know, I like green. That doesn't make me a boy.
It doesn't affect your gender.
You know, my girls, they'll go out and play trucks. And again, like they're into some of those hobbies. And my son will do all of that with them. But there are a lot of things where he is more sensitive. I mean, he's going through a different developmental stage than some of my younger girls. And hormones, you know, teenage boys cry easier than anybody you've ever met on this planet. They really just do.
I work with adolescents, and they say girls are drama. Some of these boys are just as dramatic as the girls.
And that's okay. Mm-hmm. We just love them for who they are, and we raise them to be strong yet sensitive men who can have a successful family someday and take that real masculinity into the world, because that is something that we are lacking, is that true masculinity.
I have 2 girls and 2 boys, and when they were little, my younger daughter really liked cars, and she'd ask me why the boys were getting all the car things and whatever, so I'd make sure to get her a car too. So when the girls got Cabbage Patch dolls, my older son was like, well, why don't I get a Cabbage Patch doll? So I thought, all right.
Okay.
So I bought him a Cabbage Patch doll. It was a boy. I just thought it'd be cute to get him. The boys got boys and the girls got girls. And then one day he was probably, he'll have to correct me, maybe third grade, where it's kind of getting in the area there where I thought he wanted to take it for show and tell. And I thought, okay, he's going to get criticized by some of his youth. So I just prepared him. And I said, you know, not every kid out there is lucky enough to have a doll.
Yeah.
So if anybody bothers you about, and I can't remember the name of his doll, but I said, you just let him know, because he would play. He was the father of the doll. He didn't play. He was the mother of the doll. He patterned mail and looked at his father and his parents, and they'd play together with their dolls. And I said, if anybody bothers you and tells you that you're whatever because you have this doll, I said, you just remind them, oh, were you not going to be a father when you grow up? I'm his father. Gave him some sort of verbiage. I'd always give him stuff to give talk back to the bullies. Yeah. And it happened, and he did, and the kid thought it. He said the kid just kind of looked at him and went, well, can I play with your doll?
Yeah, well, I teach my boys to cook, and sometimes I have my girls mow the lawn. Like, it's just a life skill, right? And kids learn through play. And so you have to allow that play, because that's how they process and how they make sense of the world around them. So, absolutely.
Yeah, I was the oldest of 6, and growing up, and my parents worked all day long. In fact, when we got up to go to school in the mornings, they were usually already at work. So it was my job to get up and get the rest of the kids up and going. So I had to learn how to cook. So I had to cook breakfast for all my younger brothers and siblings. My 2 sisters, Angeline being one of them, she'll tell you that I had to learn how to do their hair, and I had to do their hair every single morning, get them ready to go, because then my bus would hit, because the high school would always have the earlier buses, and then I had to leave, and then they would just have to go get the bus on their own. But yeah, I learned all of that, learned how to play with dolls, because I had to get down and play with them and babysit and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, you just have to learn those skills and those just life skills as you grow up, and just to be tolerant of that. But what I see more often happening is kids, these progressive ideas and these stupid ideas, or frankly, they're coming onto them, are not necessarily being pushed on for the benefit of the child. They're not really looking at the child as this is for their better good. They're using the child as a tool. They're using it as a weapon to be able to force their ideals out into the community. And as we've said on many of these podcasts, it becomes a kind of a sob story that they put out in the media. Oh, there's going to be higher suicide rates if you don't start letting them have their decisions earlier. There's going to be a lot more bullying if you don't let them have their decisions early. And they use these suicide and bullying and all these other sob stories to kind of twist the general society's hearts into thinking that they're right, when none of that is true. It's actually just the opposite. Suicides go up in the transgender community. They get worse. The bullying goes up in the transgender community because it just gets worse. And then the vast majority of those teenagers will be kind of in that fog for a couple years, and then they just realize that that's just not the way it was, and they just want to grow out of it as they get later on into life. And then if they do anything too drastic, then those decisions are made, and now they can't recover from them. And I'm seeing a lot of that is happening down the line in their 20s, where they're trying to detransition, and it becomes even greater problems.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons that I'm so glad that we in Utah, we don't allow the medical transitioning of children anymore. No surgeries, and you can only have the medications if you were already on them, because you can't cut somebody cold turkey. I mean, there's other medical implications that come with that. But when it comes to starting new kids through that medical process, we don't do that. You know, and that was Senator Kennedy, or back when he was still State Senator Kennedy, before he became Congressman Kennedy, and Representative Hall back in 2023. And that was a really big step forward for exactly the reason that you're saying. We do know that suicides go up, and there's not enough evidence or enough research to even know what the long-term implications of putting someone on the wrong hormones are. We don't even know what medical impacts that's going to have on somebody long term. We know there's social impacts, but we don't know what those physical impacts are. And it's interesting to see people who are professionals, who are supposed to do no harm, going through and prescribing some of these things. And I like to believe, and I know that it's not going to be 100% across the board, but I like to believe that people do it because they're sincerely trying to help. But I don't believe that's the case in all cases by any means.
I believe that the vast majority of the time that is not the case, that they're trying to help. I think, and I'm going to compare two things together. You look at the transgender community where they're trying to push this on kids. Then you look at the divorce community where children in a divorce become pawns to either spouse. And I think women are guilty of it more than men, where they're trying to use the kids as a pawn against the other spouse and trying to take time away or trying to pawn their kids and say certain remarks about
parental alienation.
Yeah, parental alienation. They're trying to say certain remarks against the children, to the children about the other parent, and it creates this animosity between the parents, but also between the children and parents, and then the children eventually growing out of it. I think it's the same exact mentality, where the children all of a sudden become a pawn for your endeavors, for what you're trying to push across, and it's never in the best interest of the children. And I think that what they're trying to do in the transgender community is use children as pawns and not necessarily do anything for the best interest of them. It's the exact same type of, and I'm going to call it selfish mentality, where I want to push these principles across, and I think that's the best instrument or tool to use to get it across. Is the earlier I can push this across, the better, because then it forces the rest of the world to accept that. And then again, they use these sob stories, this rhetoric, these lines that hit the news stations about, again, suicide and about bullying and not being accepting, and that you're being demeaning and harmful to the children. And that's what that is. It's just a sob story to twist hearts into thinking that good is evil and evil is good.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that you make the divorce comparison also, because last year, the 2024 general session, I ran a bill with Mike Kennedy to make it so that gender identity, gender expression, your identification with the LGBT community cannot be a factor in divorce proceedings, because we've seen across the country parents running into conflict on this particular issue. We've seen judges award custody to parents who want to affirm identity, block out parents who don't, and vice versa, depending on what political climate that you live in. And so last year, and this was unanimous bipartisan in the House of Representatives, including all of our Democrats, but we went through and said, that is not a factor unless there is other abuse that occurs as part of that. So like dad can't beat Billy because Billy wants to be Sally. You know, that brings in another abuse factor with physical abuse. But gender and LGBTQ status cannot be taken into consideration as part of any sort of custody proceeding. And it also prohibited the state from removing children through DCFS from their homes for parents disagreeing with their child's gender identity or taking issue with their LGBTQ community status. And so it's very neutral. It doesn't prioritize one direction over another. I think that these families have enough challenges that they're trying to work through as they navigate this new process. But the courts and the state are going to stay out of that. And that issue is going to remain in the family where it belongs, without us putting our thumb on the scale and trying to get in between a parent and a child because of our own political ideologies.
That's great to hear.
I think that just happened in Colorado too, and I think it's happening up in Oregon. I was just watching a news report of a father standing up in front of a public hearing where he had lost his children. The courts took his children from him because the mother was identifying the children as gay, lesbian, and he refused to do that. And they said that they labeled him as a child abuser, and he had to go to child abuse classes and all this other kind of stuff. And he said it just ruined my complete relationship with the kids, because
what a nightmare.
They put their finger on the scale and says, because you won't acknowledge their gender identity, you're now an abusive father. And he just lost them completely.
Yeah, and we spelled out that that is not child abuse, not acknowledging their gender identity. It literally just says it cannot be considered, which means you can't look at it. You have to determine best interests of that child without taking the gender question into consideration. So they can still look at child abuse, they can look at neglect, they can look at all of those other things. You know, what parent has the time, they can look at everything that they normally look at. but they cannot factor in an agreement or a disagreement with that gender expression, with that LGBT community status. They can't. And the state, with removing children, we can't. It's irrelevant. So
I wonder if you have any other states looking at how you were able to pass this for their states.
Not that I know of.
There should be.
But Senator Kennedy and I did that last year, so in the 24 general session. And I actually, it was toward the end of last year, received a phone call and learned that my bill had actually been applied here in the state of Utah, and that there were some issues, and there was a child within the transgender community who ended up, they did end up in DCFS custody for other reasons. But watching the neutrality play out and the foster placements and everything kind of play out with this, we don't consider gender identity, while still protecting a foster family's right to deny a child based on being uncomfortable with having, someone of the LGBT community in their homes. Because you do have that too. You have people that won't be comfortable caring for that child. But it helped. It helped a child. And so there's at least one in the state of Utah where this has come into play. And it was really cool, talking to a person that was involved in that case and hearing the story and being able to say, you know what, we made a difference. And that child's life, it's already hard enough, and we didn't make it worse. We actually did something good.
Good.
So it was really great. And when I heard that story, I reached out to a friend across the aisle who it was a very sensitive topic for, and she understood why we were doing it and saw how it could be helpful. And I said, hey, I just had this phone call, and she got really emotional. I was like, thank you so much for sharing that with me. And so it was a bipartisan effort, again, unanimous in the House of Representatives. The Senate was a little different, but within the House, it was unanimous. And it was really cool to have both sides come together for the greater good of a child by saying, you know what, this is not the government's responsibility here.
Yeah, keeping government out as much as possible is always good.
Yeah.
This next portion that we want to discuss, I bring it open so it's just so the general public can really understand how close to home this can get. Because again, my whole philosophy behind this is this needs to stay out of children permanently. That this should not be involved with kids. They need to have the time to grow. And even in such a conservative state as here in Utah, you can start seeing some of these things start to trickle in, like what we're going to discuss here that's happening in Oregon. So electing your officials becomes even more critical. Your delegates particularly important, because then they're going to go and kind of question these candidates to make sure you get the right people getting into office. Because even as a county delegate, as a state delegate as I am, I saw some of this trying to trickle into our county election with our county commissioner. I saw some of these points of view amongst other delegates, and I particularly saw it in the race for our State Board of Education. And just to see how extreme Oregon has gotten, we're looking at specifically a document that was put out back in 2023 by the Oregon Department of Education. And then it was updated here this year to include boys and girls sports. But we're going to go over a few of the things. Again, most of this is not yet a concern here in Utah, but to make the public aware of what's happening in other states is going to make you a little bit more aware and a little bit more reticent of what might happen here in the state of Utah. So you got to watch for these type of things trying to creep in, because they will start to creep in if you're not careful amongst delegates, amongst elected officials. So as we go through this and discuss this, I mean, this is just going to be the discussion as to what's happening up in that state to make sure stuff like this does not creep here in the state of Utah. So a few of these things, I printed off some of them so we can go through them. So here on we're going to go out to page 8. Names and pronouns. Gender expansive students may choose to change the name and assign to them at birth to an asserted name that affirms their gender identity. So they're fully recognizing up there in the state of Oregon that kids can essentially just change their own name whenever they want to, which I think is already incredibly dangerous, because again, they're just too young to make any type of these radical decisions. And you're just going to incentivize the confusion and the mental instability even further by doing this type of stuff. They go on to say they should be referred to by their asserted name and pronouns. And this is where it's dangerous. Intentional or unintentional continuous misgendering of a student by refusing to use their asserted name and pronouns can potentially create a hostile environment. So, as a school teacher, they've literally had school teachers get brought up on reprimands within the school district for not pronouncing students correctly. So, I mean, that creates a risk level as a teacher where now you're more concerned about gendering your kids appropriately than you are about teaching a class. I mean, they go on to say it is recommended that even student IDs be issued in the name reflecting the student's gender identity consistent. So the schools even have to change their student ID to their name that the new name they selected. So if they just keep changing their name throughout the school year, I mean, I think that can get really, really abusive. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I was actually the House sponsor on a bill back in 2023. It was SB 100, and it dealt specifically with a child transitioning on school records. And basically it says here in the state of Utah, you cannot do it without written parental consent, because what the schools were doing is they were going in, and not all schools, but we were having issues in some districts, were going in and actually transitioning a child on their school records without the parent's knowledge, without the parent having anything to do with it. And again, this is one of those things like we were just talking about. The government should not be getting in between a parent and their child when it comes to these issues. And so we didn't say you can't do it. And you have to remember this was under the Biden administration still. So we had to be careful, with how we word things, because we didn't want the feds to come in and basically undo the good work we were doing. And so we said, you have to have parental consent to make these changes. A parent has to sign off in writing if you're going to make these changes. And that deals with the student IDs, it deals with the formal records and all of those things. What is a lot harder to legislate is what comes out of somebody's mouth, because you also have that free speech right. And so that's something we haven't quite figured out yet in the state of Utah is, what do you do when it's a verbal pronunciation or a teacher has an issue with a student's gender identity? And so we've been looking at different teacher protections, actually, because, I mean, like what you said, intentional or unintentional, sometimes you don't know. You just don't know. And especially in these areas or before, when the records were being changed and updated to reflect something different from what their gender at birth was. And so we've been looking at how can we protect teachers in these cases so that they don't find themselves in those situations you were talking about, where the administration will come down and disciplinary action will occur based on an accidental misgendering of a child. But we have dealt with it as far as school records and IDs and those things go.
Well, I'm hoping that parents or teachers have the right just to not have to use pronouns, because, I mean, teachers have that right to religious freedom and morals and values of their own, and if they don't want to identify someone according to the pronouns that they pick and choose, and they should be obligated to do so. That's, again, where I draw the line is, as a transgender person, you can do what you want to do, be transgender all you want, but the second you cross the line, you're forcing me to pronoun you in a certain way or name you in a certain way. That's where it's imposing upon my freedom.
Right, your freedom of speech, if nothing else, your freedom of association, all of those things.
Teachers. Mm-hmm. Teachers should not be obligated one way or the other to do any of this. If it's on your birth certificate, they should be allowed to use that period, end of story.
Yeah, and that's what we've been, where's the sweet spot where we can honor the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech. And so rather than saying you don't have to do this, the easiest way to do it is to create the protections for teachers so that when they're exercising their free speech, they know that there's not going to be that fallout. They're not going to lose their jobs for doing so. So that's kind of the direction that we've been moving on that.
Yeah, if kids want to pronoun themselves amongst their friends or something like that, do it at home, or parents are okay with it. Right. You're free to do that. But then outside of that world, that's where that
well,
that
and
line
it's
needs to get
difficult.
drawn.
We see patients in our office who we've been seeing, for 4 or 5 years. We already know you as your true identity, and then you're wanting to have a different identity. it's unnatural to ask me to not make a mistake when you're like, so she needs A, B, C, D, and then they turn around and they go, he or they. And I'm like, look, I'm just trying to do my job here. I don't need to stop and start thinking. And then you have to speak in proper grammar. I mean, when the they came about, I thought, oh, for pity's sakes, that doesn't even make a proper sentence. You know, and it's like, and I finally had to tell, and it was a patient that was coming from one of the treatment facilities, and whose parents or guardians had said, my child didn't have any of these issues until they came. They were there for a different reason. And now while they're in there, because these other patients are there transitioning, suddenly they're having to question to fit in. They have to question or pretend they're this. And that's why they were asking me to. And she said, I prefer if you use them, they. And I said, I will do my best. I said, but I'd ask some grace for you, since that's not natural for me to do, because they didn't look like them. They were clearly in their natural identity, the way they were dressed and things. And so as I'm just freely speaking healthcare concerns, it's hard for me to have to stop and think about my English. It's a mess.
Yeah. I just straight up won't do it. Yeah, you're free to tell me. I can refer to you as they, them. I just won't do it. So, I'll respect you to go your direction. You have to respect me to go
Then
mine.
you call me Princess Ingrid, because that's how I identify.
You are princess in all of the good ways.
Yes, thank you.
None of the bad.
It gets worse though, because not only would they have to change their IDs and make sure they pronoun them, but now it goes into the next section here. It says let me get to the right page here first. Hold on, everybody.
So page 9,
Yeah.
self-expression.
So on the next section here, it says self-expression in schools. Gender expression refers to a way in which a person expresses their gender, often through appearance, dress, and behavior. Goes on to say the First Amendment, so they're trying to blend the First Amendment, protects the rights of students' freedom of expression. So the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, doesn't necessarily protect your dress code. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that has anything to do with the First Amendment. But now the dress code is being affected here, so a student can come to school dressed as the opposite gender, and then again the teachers can't say anything or do anything about it. So even if it's a mocking joke, they could get in trouble for getting on a student for cross-dressing. So you could have some boy that thinks he's funny, wants to mock the whole thing in itself, and just goes to school dressed as a girl just to be funny, and then they have to take it seriously. So again, I think this is, again, just taking things a little too far when you're now affecting the dress code and letting getting students just do whatever they want, wear whatever they want to school. I think that creates a in-focused atmosphere for the other students. It affects everybody in the classroom, where a classroom there should be focused on math, English, science. There shouldn't be all these other distractions within the school. You're not there to be distracted. You're not there to worry about sexual orientation. And sexual orientation should not even be in the schools, but yet you have all this other drama, and that's all it is, just drama being introduced to schools, and the entire focus on education goes out the window. So now we as the United States, we're sitting clear down at 70th or 80th in education around the world now. And I think it's because of this defocus on education, and now we're so focused on feelings, on drama, that it's affecting the education process.
Yeah, and we know that we've seen a decline in literacy in some of those other cores. I don't know exactly where we rank in relation to the rest of the world, because education policy is not where I spend most of my time. But I mean, especially with what you said with the dress code, though, the purpose of a dress code is to prevent distraction. Like what you said, it's to focus on that learning environment. And what was interesting about the Oregon thing is they could only have a gender neutral dress code. I'm like, okay, so we're gonna say that boys also have to have their skirts down to their knees, and I'm a person where you wear what you want to wear, but there's a reason that a lot of schools have uniforms, and it's because you're trying to create that sense of community and that sense of not sameness, but like belonging within the group, and you don't have somebody stand out. And some of that is not just gender expression, but it's also income levels. You may have a child who has the ratty jeans and the old t-shirts with someone who is all brand names, brand new, never repeats an outfit.
And there's also a team, there's some science behind that you use in the workplace, that in a workplace when they wear a uniform together, they perform better as a team, and there's science behind that.
It creates that sense of community and that sense of belonging. And so one of the things that concerns me about that is it pulls that away from kids, and especially kids in high school. They're going through enough. We don't need to add anything else to their plate. But it really, there have been a lot of shifts toward the social issues and away from the academic learning. We had, it was a couple of years ago, I don't remember exactly when, but there was a big pride protest that happened in Lehigh where a bunch of high school students walked out of the classroom in support of some LGBT related policy that had changed recently at the school. They had pulled back on that policy, and there was a protest. And so kids were leaving during finals week to go and stand across the street, and their parents, some of their parents were out there with them. And I'm like, this is not what the schools are about. The schools are supposed to be for learning. We know that we don't necessarily have the best outcomes in learning. And so it's not even just within the schools, but you also have parents who support that type of behavior and are more interested in the social aspects than necessarily the academic aspects. And it's complicated and it's interesting. And from a state policy perspective, we have to be really careful to balance the teaching of history and the teaching of what happens in the real world and sterilizing classrooms to focus on issues. And it's a really sensitive policy area. It's a really fine line to teach, yes, because discrimination is a very real part of American history. It's a very real part of world history. And so to teach that, yes, discrimination happens and it's happened before. Here's what happened with we don't discriminate now, and transitioning into the new modern version of discrimination, right? It's very different. And so it's a really tricky policy area to work in. And I know it's something that we as a state have kind of picked at and pushed on over the last several years with trying to get right. And there's definitely more to do in that space. But again, you can't have a sterile classroom, because in a sterile classroom, you're also not teaching, what the real world is and what the history is. You don't want to whitewash history, as we call it, or delete any of the bad. We have to be able to talk about both sides of that issue freely. And so how do you do that while also making sure that you don't have teachers who are pushing political agendas? And it's complicated.
Well, I'm glad they took the whole flag thing out. They did that a couple years ago. Just the American flag, the Utah state flag. There's no...
That was just this year.
No, that was just this year that they did that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad they did that. But like I said, my opinion is you just need to keep the sexual orientation stuff and the sex education down to bare minimum. If you as a parent want to teach that, that's your prerogative as a parent. I mean, that is your right as a parent. The government should not be imposing anything on you as a parent as to what you teach and don't teach at home, whether that's conservative Christian values or if that's something on the LGBTQ spectrum. You're allowed to do that at home, but that's where it should stay, is at home. At school, the focus should be on education and only on education, and keeping those children where the mental instability is down to a minimum, and creating the drama at the school level is just going to increase that mental stability.
Well, and
it's bad as teenagers, but it's even worse when they start pushing it down to the elementary school level, which is what they're doing now.
Yeah, so this last session, in addition to the pride flags in schools, I actually had a bill. It was House Bill 281, and it was Health Curriculum and Procedures Amendments. And it's the same bill that we had touched briefly on with the mental health and the parental guardrails, but it also is an overhaul of our sex education. And so really what it does is it changes things like human sexuality. So human sexuality has been in statute as part of our sex ed curriculum. Now, when that was put in, it more meant physiology. But as society changes, vocabulary changes also. So we changed it. It no longer says we're teaching human sexuality. It says we're teaching human development, including maturation, and the pregnancy and birth process. And so it takes it back to those very basic scientific facts. But then the other really neat thing that we did with it is it changes the entire goal of the sex ed curriculum to be through the lens of the success sequence. And if you're not familiar with the success sequence, basically what it says is first you graduate high school, and then you get married, and then you have children within a stable and healthy marriage. And we know that when you do those things in that order, you're significantly less likely to end up in poverty.
Best results.
Those are the best results. And so when we're talking about these things going forward within our sex ed, it has to be from that lens of promoting graduation, marriage, and then kids. But as part of that comes some of those more norms, right? The LGBT community, when you have people and their parts don't necessarily mix to have a baby, that doesn't fit within that success sequence, because part of the success sequence is having children if you can. And we recognize that not everybody is going to be able to have kids. I mean, that's also just a part of life. But we also include adoption and things like that as part of our curriculum. But it really pulled back. It says you can't teach intricacies of intercourse. You can't teach anything that is related to sexual stimulation. You can't teach sexual preferences. None of that can be taught. It takes it back to the very, very basics. Physiology, here are your body parts. Here is how they work. Here are the changes your body will go through as you mature. And it takes it back to what was going to be more the sex ed curriculum when we were going through school back in the day, and just goes back to the basics and pulls out those words that kind of change over time.
And for
like
those that
human
say you're trying
sexuality.
to keep them naive, you don't want them to be educated on how those things work. No, it's just that's not going to be taught in the school. You get to take them home and teach them the way that you value that. And how it should go in your family.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that it spells out, these are the things you are allowed to teach. They're very, very clearly well defined to meet those very scientific basic standards. And there's a line in that bill that says anything that's not on this list related to this, you cannot talk about. And so if it's not explicitly allowed, then it is explicitly not allowed. And so we're going to see some changes coming up with the curriculum on that should pull back on some of that sexuality education in the classrooms. And there's another line in the bill. We've talked a lot about the pride flags as a state over the last little bit. We know that our capital city went and changed their flags based on the flag ban that kind of went into effect there. But one of the things that we also did in this HB 281 is right now the districts are allowed to set their own anti-discrimination policies. And what some of the districts have done is allowed like the pins and the buttons and the pride lanyards and those things in the classroom that are not flags. But what this bill did is it has a little line in there on discrimination that says, regardless of LEA, state board, individual school policy, you may not. And then it lists out the discrimination factors that are already included. So you can't promote or disparage one group above another, which actually should go back when it comes to when you're wearing a button, you are promoting one group over another. And it should pull back on that. And if not, then teachers will find themselves in trouble with the State Board of Education and potentially licensing implications. And so that was a change that we just made in this last session. We'll see where the loopholes pop up during the upcoming school year, because I'm not naive enough to believe there aren't any.
So does that prohibit a kid from wearing a MAGA t-shirt?
It doesn't touch kids. It's talking about the faculty, because again, there's that freedom of expression. And I don't know how you balance the restriction with the constitutional rights. And so, again, that's one of those tricky areas. Maybe we just go to uniform statewide. I don't know what the answer to that is. But at least when it comes to faculty and those who are employed by state and government agents or entities, we do have control from that employer perspective. And so to make it very, very clear that you cannot do these things, you cannot teach these things, you cannot, it should help pull back on some of those societal changes that we see coming out of the schools. And just to be very clear, I don't think all teachers are bad. I know some wonderful, wonderful teachers, but just like any profession, there is going to be somebody that's maybe not the best. And so to pull back on that and again, keep that back in the hands of the parents is the ultimate goal here. And we backfilled the flags by adding the discrimination language. So, I mean, it does address the lanyards and the things that many in the education community were talking about. Well, if we can't have flags, we'll just put our pins on. Well, you can't actually, and that's in this bill. And I don't know if they realized that at the time because they were so focused on that pride flag bill, but it's in there and they know it now. And the state board has been educating the districts on what that looks like. And in talking to one of our state board members about it, she said that she asked a couple of districts, what are you going to do about these pins and these buttons? And they said, oh, well, we get to set our own policy. She's like, actually, you don't anymore. And pulled up the bill and the state law that says you don't get to decide that. That is done statewide. You have one standard that the entire state has to adhere to. And so hopefully we see a shift back toward education by pulling some of that societal issue out of the schools.
Well, because the last thing I want to see is that indoctrination, and like you said, there's always bad apples in every group. Most of the teachers are really good. My wife's a school teacher. She's been a school teacher for 20 years, teaching kindergarten. But I've seen it in Utah County. I've seen it in others where there's certain teachers out there that want to push their agenda more than they want to push education, and they're just trying to find every which way to do that. And I think that pulls a lot of the rights from the parents, because the parents are like, no, I'm sending my kid to school to learn, not be indoctrinated. I don't need you pushing your values on them. That is my job as a parent. Whether, again, I'm a parent that's going to teach conservative values, or I'm a parent that's going to teach them whatever else I want to teach them, that is my right as a parent, and that's where it should remain. So I think keeping that down to physiology is exactly where it needs to be at. And
I wonder how that's going to affect in this next year. I see teachers here in our county that are wearing, they either have, their rainbow shirts on or whatever. They have their hair dyed that color or a cord, and then some sort of, I can't remember what the wording was, but like it'll have the rainbow and then say, I am a safe place. Well, shouldn't every teacher in the whole school be a safe place?
Yeah, they should.
Would they be able to wear these things? I mean, why do you have to wear a button saying you're a safe person? Which teacher is not a safe person?
So anything that constitutes as promoting one group over another is how it works through the state board. So if you see things like that, and if this goes for any parent who's trying to navigate this in the schools, if you see things like that, report it to the state board. They have a reporting process now where they will go in and investigate based on those parental reports. And especially where the law has changed, and it's a whole lot tighter now with what they can and cannot do in relation to that. I think that you'll see a lot of that pulled back.
So it goes to the state board.
It goes to the state board. And the state board obviously has a lot of control there. And so if they absolutely can take negative action against the teacher. Teachers could lose employment based on failure to comply with what's in state law. You can't have somebody not following the law in charge of our kids. We just can't do that. And so I think that we'll probably see, as we get used to this, an uptick in complaints there. And they have a lot of educating to do amongst the educators on what now is and isn't allowed. And hopefully the districts play ball with that. But I assume we will have some that have to get dragged along by their hair. So we'll see.
I've seen that a lot, because there's a lot of teachers that are really, really just want to push agenda. That they're really stuck on that, and they think it's wrong to not allow them to push that agenda. And again, I've only seen a few, not very, very many. Most of the teachers, like I said, are good, but there's a couple that are just really stuck in their way and their mindset, and you're not going to convince them otherwise. And it's going to be these hard laws, or it's going to be getting fired. That's the only thing that's going to change that.
Yeah, and that's on the table.
It's on the table. One of the most dangerous things that I've seen up in this Oregon is taking that out of parents' hands completely. We discussed this clear back in with Trevor Lee, that they had just passed this law where the schools up there do not have to tell the parents anything about gender transitioning or the students thinking about gender transitioning. And then the governor up there signed that into law just a couple months ago. And that's part of what you're seeing up on your screen here right now. It says, if a school opts not to notify students' parents or caregiver for any of the above safety reasons, the school may wish to consider supporting the student by providing access to another supportive adult the student can rely on throughout the school's response process. I mean, response to transitioning.
Yeah.
If a school decides that they must notify a parent or caregiver against the wishes of the student, the school should carefully consider the extent to which the student's gender identity needs to be revealed in the notification. And up above, it actually goes through what they would consider bullying and referring to that the parent would be the bully if the parent is not accepting the gender transitioning. And then they could literally label the parent as the bully and say, okay, as a school, we no longer have to inform the parents about anything.
Yeah, so
that is incredibly scary when they're just pulling parents out completely.
it's a really big problem. And one of the things that I've been so grateful about Utah is that we largely believe that parents should remain in that driver's seat. And so that same bill we were talking about with the sex education, it really goes into this with the mental health side of it also. So a lot of this focuses on providing a person to kind of help the child through that transition. But what we did this last session is we said, you can't see a child without their parent consenting to it. Also, the parent can take certain topics off limits for that mental health provider, whatever type of mental health provider they are. And so I, as a parent, if my child is going in for some sort of therapy or mental health support in a school setting, and I say, I don't want you talking to my child about LGBTQ issues, and that person talks to my child about LGBTQ issues, that is now a licensing and a fireable violation. And so we said, you have to respect what the parent says there, or you very well could face termination. But then we also said, you have to notify the parent after you talk to the child as well, with a summary of what was discussed during that session. Now, it doesn't have to be like a 10-page dissertation on what was talked about, but you have to at least hit on the highlights of that conversation and make sure that the parent knows that they are legally entitled to access all of the notes. So in nationally, under HIPAA, parents have a right to all of their child's medical records. Under FERPA, which is the school privacy, they have a right to all of their child's school records. So you combine the two, parents have a right to every single little bit of information that goes on, every conversation that occurs. Parents have a right to know that, federally and in the state of Utah. And we said, instead of the parent having to go proactively get that information and have to submit grammar requests or go through the process of trying to navigate the red tape to get access to what they're legally entitled to, we said, no, actually, we're going to make the provider be the one that has to be proactive. And so parents can opt out of receiving that notification, but the default is that that parent is notified every single time somebody has a mental health related conversation with their student. Now, there's a couple exceptions if you're worried about an imminent suicide, and a delay to contact parent could mean that that suicide could happen right then. So we're talking very, very imminent physical danger, like the child's about to jump off a roof or something. Then you could pull back, assess, handle the situation, and then you are required to notify the parent and still go through the whole process, receive consent in order to work with that child ongoing. But you can address that like very, very immediate harm situation. And that's the carve out. And then the other one is if a child discloses, my parents beat me, or, so-and-so, this parent molested me, so there are some safety considerations there that don't require that immediate reporting. But anything within this gender space, if they're providing additional mental health resources, the parent is fully in control of that process. And that was very controversial during this last session. It was both internally and externally controversial.
Really?
There were a lot of school-based therapists who felt like they had the right to talk to your child about whatever they wanted to talk to your child about. And fortunately, my colleague said, actually, no, that's not the case. The parents get to remain in the driver's seat. But prior to this bill, they didn't have those guardrails. And so this put it again, this is the most comprehensive parental rights and mental health in schools bill that exists in the entire United States. And there are other states that are trying to duplicate what we've done here in Utah. I've had multiple states reach out to me about this. And it's been really, really interesting to hear some of the challenges that they get. But the argument is always the safety of the child. Well, I don't think it's safe for somebody else to be sitting there chirping in my child's ear about whatever they want. If I say I don't want you talking to my kid about sex, you don't get to talk to my kid about sex. And in fact, I find it very, very creepy that another adult thinks they can talk to my child about sex without my consent. Mm-hmm. And so it really pulls back hard. So if we were to take this Oregon section, in order to do any of that mental health support, it all have to go through the parent. They cannot do it without risking losing their jobs here in Utah. And that was a huge change. It's going to be a huge cultural change. But it, in my opinion, is one of the most impactful pieces of legislation that we looked at this session, because it really pulls back so hard on that, and it puts those parents in the driver's seat. They get to decide the topics, and they get the rundown at the end of the session.
Does this bill only affect therapists, or does it affect the actual teacher as well?
So it goes through and it defines what the mental health services are, because technically you can't have anybody operating outside the scope of their license. Teachers are not licensed to provide mental health services. And so it says, like basic friendship things are like, some group places will do like friendship circles. They'll talk about like, we don't hit people, like just basic skills. And then also basic stress management, like, well, if you did your homework early, you wouldn't be so stressed out about not having enough recess or things like that. So like basic friendship things and basic stress management are not considered therapy, but anything else that goes into that mental health, we pulled it all from our licensing statute. So to provide any of those services that are spelled out in the licensing, which is the talk therapy, we said no group therapy, period, end of story. We actually had districts in Utah that were doing group therapy without a parent knowing about it and having kids talk about things in front of other children, which is not great in itself for so many different reasons. So we had a lot that was going on there. We just said, no, you can't do that. Like, you cannot do that. And then there is a line in the bill that says nothing authorizes anyone to act outside the scope of their license. So a teacher's license doesn't include mental health. A student counselor's license doesn't include mental health. In order to do anything related to mental health, you have to bring in a licensed mental health professional, which again, we go through and we outline what that looks like, and the parent is in control.
Yeah, this is incredibly scary here, because imagine the abuses that could happen with something like this they've done up in Oregon, because there's a big difference between agenda and I'm an educated person. So all you have to have is a school counselor that just starts mocking you as a parent, saying, and telling your student that don't listen to your parents anymore, essentially in coded words, right? They're not supporting you. They're not supportive people. We'll support you here at the school level. You just need to rely on us. And you could completely turn kids against their parents.
Yeah.
All you need to do is have some agenda-driven person at the school level, and this could go way wrong. I mean, it's like having an abusive person at DCFS, right? Where they just see the slightest abuse and they just start taking kids out of homes for no real reasons. And it's that type of abuses that could really, really get out of control here. And parents would just find themselves completely and utterly powerless, because now their students completely turn against them. They're having fights at home now because of the schools. And you got a child that's just off on their own, and someone at the school level is just completely enjoying every moment of it, because they're on this huge power trip. I'm more educated than you. I know more than you do, and I'm smarter than you as the parent. And it's not because they're more educated. It's because they're more agenda driven. And like I said, there's a big difference between agenda and education. And I find a lot of people on that left scope, that LGBT scope, they're more agenda driven than and like I said at the very beginning, they start using the kids as tools, as ammunition to get something across, and that it's really no longer about the best well needs of the child. It's about my agenda. I'm pushing this. I'm going to enforce this upon society, and here's my instrument. And it's just
Yeah.
poor little kid that doesn't know any better.
Yeah, and we made it pretty clear in black and white that that doesn't fly in the state of Utah. If that is how you're going to behave, you very much could lose your job. So, and again, it goes back to that reporting that we were talking about earlier. It's the same process. If you're having an issue, report it. There's an investigation. And if you're acting outside of your license, in addition to issues that you would have going through a state board of investigation and education related issues, that also kicks over to our Department of Occupational Licensing, and you could very well lose your license in addition to your job. And so there's a lot of tiebacks in this bill to try to be as tight as we could possibly get with this language to make it so we don't see that. We can't force everybody to follow the law, but we can definitely hand out consequences for those that don't.
Glad to
And I
hear
can
it.
see those consequences, because you're going to get, or that pushback anyway, because I can see that there's people that get high-minded, and that's literally what it is. They get the pride, they get the high-mindedness, and they want to push their opinions, their agenda, their values more, and they want to force it upon other people. And so I can really see that.
Well, and something that was interesting that I observed as we were working through this process. So this was not just a Stephanie original brainchild. This was very much a collaborative process with a lot of different people. We had our Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health weighing in. We had the Utah School Mental Health Collaborative weighing in. And all of those higher level professionals supported what we were doing. It was the ones that were some of the lower licenses who are generally practicing in the schools that really took issue with it. But the psychologists, we had several psychologists who were licensed practicing. They work with kids. They were like, yes, love it. Like, absolutely love it. And I had a psychologist afterwards talking to me. This was a month or so after session ended. And he was telling me, because these were hours-long public hearings. These were actually probably longer than the transgender dormitory bill public hearings. These were really long public hearings. And he was there, and he told me afterward that it absolutely floored him to see how many therapists thought that they had a right to talk to your kid about whatever they wanted. He's like, that's never how it works. And that's not how it works in the private sector. If you take your child out for private sector therapy, that therapist works for you. You're the one that pays that bill, and they adhere to the guidelines that you put into place. But that wasn't the case in the schools. So we took that private sector authority, put it into the schools, tightened it up a little bit more, because you don't get to pick who your therapist is if you're doing it through the school. But it was really interesting to hear some of those higher level, higher degrees, because a psychologist is obviously going to go to more school than a therapist is going to. And to hear them say, yes, we need this. This is great. We love this. This is amazing. And then to have the therapy community kicking and screaming. And again, not all of them. I take my kids to therapy, not in the school setting, but outside of that. And I love our therapists, but I also get to pick who they are.
Yeah. I worked in the school system for several years, and I can see how some well-meaning educators and therapists, I'd watch them from that end where you get so focused on we're going to do what's best for our students that you kind of forget your focus that it's the parent's child. They start feeling, these are our kids. We know what's best. They see all the parents, including the lousy parents. So then they think, we need to do this because, these parents don't understand how important this is. And then just slowly it just kind of turns into, we know what's best for our students.
Well,
and they lose focus.
Yeah, and that was said during those public hearings. We had therapists say, we know better than the parents. And I don't ever believe that. I think that the parent is the ultimate authority with some limited exceptions.
And you may know something they don't know, but you forget that's their child.
Right.
And where the table's reversed, you might see things a little differently if that were your child.
Right.
Yeah, it's that high-mindedness that I know more than the parents. That's just a scary attitude. And there's a lot of them that legitimately believe that. They legitimately believe that if a parent does not accept a child's gender transition, that is straight up abuse. And they will treat you as an abusive parent because you're not accepting it. And
Right.
they will get aggressive in that belief too. And not your kid.
Yeah, well, and we got on that topic, just to make sure we're not confusing what constitutes abuse, is we got very specific with here are the things that you don't have to tell the parent right away, and they're those mandatory reports. You know, if you see a child being hit, or if you know, again, sexual abuse, like we got very prescriptive with these are the reasons you don't have to talk to a parent. Everything else, you have to.
Yeah. Parents are in the driver's seat. Parents have absolute say. You have none until parents give you permission to say so.
And I love the bill. As a foster parent, I see child abuse. I know what it looks like. I've seen a lot. It's horrible, and it will rip your heart out. And so to be able to strike this balance of parents know best while also protecting those actual safety concerns, not the social, but the actual safety concerns, was something that was really important to me to get right. And I feel like we did that.
Yeah. Well, you take that last paragraph and then you combine it with this one, and it becomes even scarier. So districts and schools have responsibilities related to gender-affirming care. Oregon law requires designating personnel to follow medication administration requirements to determine if the prescribed frequency or schedule of gender-affirming medication necessitates its administration within schools in order for the student to attend or remain in school, as they do with all medications. So now you have a school that no longer has to tell the parents about the kids transitioning and can select and say that parents are now abusive because they're not accepting it. And so now they're completely replacing the parent with some other adult. And that's literally completely replacing the children or the parent with some other adult. And now the school can literally go out and start giving your kids medication.
Yeah.
Without you even knowing it.
That's a
And
problem.
That's freaky to me that all of a sudden my school is all of a sudden now medic, psychologist all in one, and then can completely replace me and just transition my kids without even my knowledge.
Yeah, and that was one of the challenges and one of the things that came up as we were working through that mental health component, because you do have some mental health providers who can prescribe. A typical therapist cannot, but a psychologist can. And really what we said too was the schools are not for diagnosing. That is something you need to go figure out. The school, any sort of mental health support that happens in a school setting should be with the goal of academics. That is what it is for. It's a short term. Let's kind of triage maybe some of the issues that are distracting you from your learning while you can go and get help in the private sector, again, under the supervision and the guidance of your parents. And so to put those requirements into place, I think was really good, especially when it came to the diagnosing and the prescribing, right? All of that has to come from outside. We're not doing that in the schools.
Yeah. I mean, it's my philosophy that outside of an aspirin or a Tylenol or an allergy med of some kind, schools shouldn't be given any type of medication to a child.
Right. You need your EpiPen in case kid gets stung by a bee or eats a peanut. Like, there's always reasons to have some sort of emergency care available. You know, or maybe they need medication for a seizure disorder or something, right? But that's not the school nurse saying, oh, I think you have a seizure disorder, and prescribing. That's something completely different.
That's where the parents are bringing it to them and say, hey, in case of emergency, here's this.
Here's the inhaler. Here's the,
Yeah, other than that, it's not the school going to their medication cabinet and saying, here, take this.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, as I was working on this, I met with multiple districts across the state, and there were some who thought that requiring this level of parental involvement was going to be overly burdensome on parents, so we shouldn't do it. And there were others that said...
Raising a child is burdensome on a parent.
Oh, it is. It's so true. But there were others that said, actually, we love this. We're actually really, really close. We just have to make a few minor tweaks. But the idea to include provisions about not prescribing came from one of the local districts. They're like, this is not our role. Make sure you include that too. And so, you know, that did come from the schools, which I thought was really neat. I was like, actually, yeah, you're right. That didn't occur to me, but you're totally right. Let's work that in. So it was kind of neat to have some of those ideas come from the schools also. So not all of the districts were hard to work with. Some of them were great. Some of them did not like anything at all that we did, but you know, we got there. So.
All right. Well, on to the next one here. So now they're talking about facilities, right? Having men and boys' bathrooms, men and girls' bathrooms, men and girls' locker rooms. And they really go all out on this because they really are not impeding anything. And that is scary for me as a parent to think that my daughter could go to school and have a boy in there. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing that she could do about it. She would just have to walk out. And in fact, there's an actual news report of where a young woman, I think this was in Colorado, went into the locker room to change for, I think she was a soccer player or something like that. And there was a boy in there completely naked, changing. He was a transgender, and she just left. She just left. I'll wait for him to change. I'll come back in and change myself because she was uncomfortable with changing in front of him. Yeah. And the boy reported it to the administration saying that I'm offended because she wouldn't change in front of me. And because he was offended, then the administrator came and got involved and forced her to go back in there. So where you have an administrator watching a teenager undress in front of a boy. And I think that's straight up arrestable, and you should be in prison if you have another adult forcing that. I mean, that is...
Yeah, there's nothing about that that's okay.
There's nothing
Absolutely
about that
nothing.
that's okay.
No.
So here, they have these sob stories, and they always disguise everything, and it's almost like they're defending their point of view with court action here. So they go in here and say 44% of transgender students were unable to use the school bathroom aligned with their gender. Oh no. Like that was a bad thing. So again, they're making bad things look good and good things look bad. Like all of a sudden there's something wrong that 44% of transgender students weren't able to walk into the opposite gender's bathroom.
Well, and that's one of the things I really liked about Representative Birkeland's bill that she ran on bathroom spaces was it requires the single use option. And it's the same concept with the dormitories, right? You have to create a space because you don't want harassment occurring on either side. And so that was one of the things that I thought was really neat is that she has that space and there is that single use. And I've heard complaints that, oh, they put the single use down way out of the way. I mean, we fit it in where it can fit in the floor plan. Like we're not trying to make your bathroom hard to access, but
there's so many things you can do with walls.
Yes, exactly. And if you have that space, there's nobody else in that bathroom. And so nobody's feeling unsafe by a person being in there changing, and that person doesn't need to feel unsafe by somebody else being in there changing. And I mean, I was the kid in high school where I would not have undressed in a locker room, like period, end of story. I would have been in that bathroom anyway, just because that's what was comfortable for me. And it creates that opportunity also. And so that was one of the things that I really appreciated. And so sure, it's not the bathroom that they align with, but it is a place where they can be safe and free from discrimination and harassment. And so can everybody else in that school.
Yeah. Well, again, like I said, they go through and they really try to defend it. It says Oregon state law affirms that students have the right to use school facilities such as restrooms, locker rooms, and showers in a manner consistent with their gender identity. So they have to let males into girls' showers, not just the locker room.
I wonder how they make that compute with the executive order we saw defining men and women. It'd be interesting to see.
They're fighting it, just like Maine is.
Yeah.
Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we all love the Ninth Circuit, upheld the right of the transgender Oregon student to access facilities consistent with their gender identity. The court's decision affirmed that there is no violation of Title IX, privacy rights of other students, or parental rights when the school supports transgender students in gender-affirming restroom, locker room, and other facility usage. Various other courts have affirmed similar protections for students in other regions of the country. Gender-expansive students should not be prohibited from accessing their facilities that align with their asserted gender identity.
Well,
requiring gender-expansive students to only utilize a single-use facility, which is what you're saying is requiring that they can only use a single-use facility and prohibiting them from using other facilities that align with their gender identity simply because of their gender identity could constitute discrimination under Oregon law. So they're saying,
and we disagree there, right?
You can't force them.
Well, and something that kind of came up too as you were talking about that is we talk about using the facility that aligns with your gender identity. There are two types of facilities, and gender, so I'm told, is a huge spectrum So there are still only two options. There may not be a facility option that aligns with someone's gender identity.
Good point.
There may not, because we have the men's bathroom and we have the women's bathroom. So if you identify as anything else on that spectrum, that's not even physically possible for you to use a facility that aligns with your identity, which again brings these single-use options back into play because they can be used for anything. And so it's not even, so this doesn't make sense to me just from that perspective, because I feel like they're talking out of both sides of their mouth when they say that, because it just doesn't make sense, right? There is no, there's no bathroom for those who are they, them, right? It doesn't exist. And so what we see is the single-use bathrooms with the little signs that have all the different combinations of people on them that are single use. So it's like, no matter what you are,
I don't even know what those
identify.
symbols look like.
Well, they're the little people, but you have like the boy and the girl, and then one of them's like a half and half. Like, you can Google it and see the signs.
I don't want to.
But that takes care of that problem, because we physically cannot even provide a bathroom for every gender identity. We would have nothing but bathrooms, which as a female, I kind of support that plan. Like I like to have a lot of bathrooms in a building, right? But it doesn't fit. The single-use option's the only way to even make that work under what they're saying they require.
And they're saying that you can't obligate them, even if you had the single-use facility, you can't force them to use it. They have to be able to go and use.
Well, they still have a choice of two bathrooms.
Well,
either their true identity or the neutral one.
Well, again, it's where this is no longer about the rights of the children or what they're really trying to do here and give the children freedom. It's all about, I'm forcing my agenda upon the rest of society, and that's literally, I'm just using this as a tool.
Yeah.
That's what it boils down to is someone got their hairs crossed up in the legislature that it was probably the same transgender legislator that put forth a lot of these laws that is putting forth this one, and they're putting forth more agenda and forcing their values and their beliefs upon the rest of society, and they don't care about the students. They don't care about what they're going through. They just want to force everybody to think their way. And that's what it really boils down to is, I'm pushing this so hard this direction because you have to believe the same way I do, or else you're wrong, you're evil.
Yeah.
And it's really just what it boils down to. Because forcing it to where a boy can walk into any girl's shower, any girl's locker room, and you cannot stop that, I think that's just straight up abuse for the girls that are in there.
Yeah, I would be uncomfortable as a female. You know, maybe if it's like my brother, they can be in the stall next to me. I don't have any brothers, so I don't know. That's why there's a maybe, right? Yeah. Grew up in an all-girls family. But, I mean, there may be people that are comfortable with members of the opposite biological sex. And that's fine, but that doesn't mean everybody is. And you shouldn't start with the assumption that we're all comfortable with that. You start with the assumption that you're not.
Yeah. And then that blends into you talking sports, like you're on a team together, but they're really the other gender, and you are doing all the showering and all the, like, girl talk's different than boy talk.
It definitely is.
Way different.
We don't tell the boys that, though. We don't want them to know.
Well, these last two are kind of going to read them off together because it goes down to this sex education thing, which is what you were talking about. And it says here that last line there, this section outlines the requirements and opportunities to affirm transgender, non-binary, and gender expansive students through instructional materials, standards, instructional practices, and opt-out policies. Yeah. And then they go on to say that these instructions have to be required in a sexuality plan of instruction. Districts must develop and approve a comprehensive plan of instruction that demonstrates how critically sexual education topics are. And not only that, but it goes on to say that it must be taught K through 12.
Yeah, and we specifically say you cannot. So I love that we're complete opposite of this.
So not only is all this legal in Oregon, but now they're saying that you have to develop curriculum that teaches transgenderism, non-binary. You have to teach it. Not only that, but you have to start at the K level, kindergarten level, teaching kids that this stuff is around. My kindergarten kid, my first graders, should not be learning any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it just goes how far, how extreme they are at trying to push, again, an agenda. They do not care about the well-being of the children. It's all about the agenda in the end. Because if you're forcing that on little kids, there's something messed up in your head.
Well, and one of the things, too, it's like we were talking about with that House Bill 281 that I ran this year, is it specifically says you can't. Human sexuality no longer exists within our sex education statute. It's all development-based. You know, these are girl parts, these are boy parts, these are how babies are made, without any of the intricacies of intercourse that come along with it. Those are specifically excluded. And then again, one of my favorite lines in that is anything that's not listed here, you can't teach as part of this. You cannot teach. And so, you know, it even gives the guidance of, well, if a question is asked that varies into these realms, you refer to the parent. Because that's the parents, right? You don't get to go down a rabbit hole because a child asked you a question related to that. You know, you can answer-ish in an age-appropriate manner, but you have to defer that back to the parent unless you can tie it into one of those approved topics. And that was such a big change that we made. I think we're going to see a world of difference coming off of that.
Yeah. And even when you started learning about sperm and ovum and all that kind of stuff, the different developments of an egg, even that was what I didn't even start learning that till late junior high and into high school.
Yeah, well, in our
it's not at the K through 6 level.
Right. And our sex ed curriculum, our health curriculum, as we call it, it does vary by grade level. You know, in kindergarten, your health curriculum is not going to include any of those topics.
Yeah.
It's going to include things like, I
Wash your
have a
hands.
head. I wash my hands. Right. Like things like kindergartners don't wash their hands, but you know, things like that are a lot more basic. I mean, they're all true, right? We all have bodies. I also think people should be very aware of their own bodies. But that doesn't mean the school needs to be talking about sex to a 5-year-old.
Yeah, I just think it's absolutely scary that they've gone that far.
Mm-hmm.
This that's put out by the Oregon State Board of Education is way, 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 way left. I mean, that is incredibly extreme how far they've gone with this thing. And then,
Do you think parents there are aware of what's in?
I'm sure they're aware. I don't know
Some
how they're
are.
supporting it. But
Yeah. Well, it depends, right? Because for those where, just like we, you know, completely fully espouse our conservative values and don't understand how anyone could do anything different, I believe that the other side has also fully espoused their values and they don't understand our point of view. So I think they have the same conversation as we do from the other side. And I mean, I come to the point with a lot of things in my life where I say, you know what, I'm not even going to try to understand this because it's not going to compute with my value system. And we just kind of move on.
agree to disagree and move on. 'Cause it's just scary to me how far that's gone, because that's the mental health of that just to children is just going to mess a lot of kids up for life, because they're just not developed. They just don't have the capacity to develop like that, and they're expecting all of a sudden K through 6 and even teenagers all of a sudden to be 25-year-old adults at such young ages. And it's just, I think they're going to have a lot of mental health repercussions the next 10, 15 years because of laws like this.
Yeah, human development does not mesh with that. I mean, again, your brain, you just said it, doesn't develop until you're 25.
Yeah.
There's a lot of growth that's got to happen, even post high school, a lot of growth.
Well, moving on from there, I mean, you do have a executive order coming from Donald Trump separating all this out and enforcing Title IX, not the way they've interpreted it, or the Ninth Court of Appeals somehow interpreted it. So there should not be any boys in girls sports, particularly in our state, because we actually passed that long before the executive order actually came into place.
Right.
We passed that, but we're still seeing some of it. I think we were at the Republican convention. I was actually interviewing my sister at the time, and her daughter was at a track meet down at BYU, and was facing a boy in her track run and at a BYU track meet. So it's still here. And so how are we preventing that from happening? How are we tightening down on that? And then all of a sudden you got, I don't know what law this was, where they have to have certain testosterone levels they have to be tested for now. And I shouldn't even think that should be even in play. If you're a boy, you should not be in girls sports, period. We shouldn't have to be testing testosterone levels at all, but somehow that's a thing now.
Yeah, so this law went into, it was several years ago. It was Representative Birkeland, and you have to remember all of this was done under the Biden administration. So we were very much under real legal threats. We saw Idaho pass an outright no boys and girls sports period ban. It was enjoined by the courts. They still can't enforce it because the courts have still held that up. Mm-hmm. So we went a little bit of a different direction and created this commission. And so any transgender student who wanted to play on the team that they identified with would have to go through this commission. And we spelled out medical providers and a number of various professionals that are appointed by the legislature, the governor, that would serve on this. And the purpose of this was to make sure there is no competitive advantage. And so it's not perfect. It's not a perfect system.
Because can't they just take a hormone shortly before the testing so that their levels are more in their favor?
So they can't. So and I'm not on this, and the proceedings are private, so I don't know like all of the little ins and outs. But they look at when you started hormone therapy. They look at all sorts of different things, testosterone levels now being part of that, and again, at rates that are tighter than the Olympics. And all of these different things, they would have to check all of these boxes to be able to play on that team. And so while, again, it's not a perfect system, it's largely been doing its job. And it's largely kept some of those boys out of those girls' activities. There have been several students that have tried to get through that have been declined based on various factors. Again, I don't know the details to the proceedings, right? So when we put this in place, we knew that states that were doing the outright ban were getting enjoined by the courts. We know that they still can't enforce their outright bans because of the courts. We do have a little bit of an activist judiciary going on. And so this was the workaround to try to do that. And even though it's not perfect, it's working better than the states that can't do anything right now.
Okay.
And so it's something that we continue to go back and make little tweaks to, right, while the legal landscape changes. And it's something, the legal landscape is another thing that we watch really, really closely, and we're hoping that under this administration we can move to that. But it's interesting because even though, yes, there's technically a legal pathway for a boy to end up on a girl's team, they're largely not. Whereas in Idaho, where they had that outright ban enjoined, there's nothing stopping those boys from being on those girls' teams, even though they passed that law. And so it was a very strategic and measured approach to get around the Biden-era legal system. And it worked for what it was supposed to do. Again, not a perfect system. Yeah. But this is one of those things where we talked about we take the needle in the right direction, even if it's not the outright victory we're hoping for.
Take the base hit and just keep on going.
Yeah, and this was probably a triple. Not quite a home run, but it was probably a triple.
Probably a triple there. But the reason I bring this up is in several instances, I find it interesting how we as legislators, or you as legislators, have to deal with a court issue and create substandard laws because you're afraid of what the courts will do. And it's where the courts are starting to legislate from the bench. They're starting to take out laws from the bench. Because the way that our system works is the legislature creates the laws, and then the judicial branch should just interpret the laws. They don't go back through and rehash those laws. You've got a certain number of congressmen, you got a certain number of senators, and they get together and they hash those laws out. They create those laws because that's what they were voted in there to do. And all that discussion that they have usually weeds out all the frailties and the failures of any certain law, and they come up with something that everybody can accept. And then you can have just one judge that says, okay, I'm throwing out everything every legislator did, every senator did. I'm going to throw out everything that 100 some odd people did in our state legislator did, or nationally 535 people did, and none of their opinions even matter. I'm just going to make my own decision now and say that law is invalid.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to rehash that law and just create the whole law myself.
Right.
Through the bench. And we're seeing a ton of that. So this is part of the problem where now you got a substandard law that's keeping men out of women's sports. But then you also look at this one, and this is exactly what you're talking about, which is why I put these things back to back. So you have one law where you guys created something that would work with the courts and keeping boys out of girls' sports. And then you have a law like this one where we're having the problem Idaho's having. Because we passed an abortion law and it is completely unenforceable right now.
Right. And we still have abortions up to 18 weeks in the state of Utah, even though we passed that heartbeat ban. And so and honestly, with the sports commission, I mean, we learn from our mistakes, right? We try to do things better. And sometimes you'll even see in a bill, there's two bills built into one. They're the same thing, but it makes severability, and it says if this portion is enjoined or paused by the courts, then we default into this next, which again is a little bit of a substandard law, but it gets around that court system. And we did that with the boys and girls sports, but we did not do that with the abortion law, and we still can't enforce our abortion law, even though that was passed years ago. And this one's been frustrating too, because even though the courts have had it for years, we can't seem to get on their docket, can't seem to get on their calendar.
Yeah, for some reason, our Utah Supreme Court won't pick this up. They won't issue a ruling on this, which is crazy to me.
It's been very much a point of frustration for the state. I can tell you that. Very, very much a point of frustration. And one thing that I actually changed last year with Senator Grover is we had a joint resolution on the court rules of civil procedure with disqualification of a judge as a matter of right. So basically what that means is that on any sort of civil proceeding, if you get assigned to a judge, and the attorneys know the judges, right? They know where their biases are. If you get assigned to a judge where you know it's not going to be a friendly judge for you, you have one disqualification as a matter of right within a certain time frame. And so you can kick the case back into the wheel and be assigned to somebody else. And that might be a better outcome, but it at least takes some of the gaming out of the legal system, because one thing that we'll see challenges to these laws filed in multiple districts, and then they'll all get assigned out to judges, and these groups will pick which judge they want based on, again, knowing the judge, knowing their history, knowing their biases, and then drop the rest of the cases so that the case ends up in that court that was essentially hand chosen by the group that is suing us over these laws. And so under this new rule, the state would then be able to say, yeah, but we disagree, and flip it back into the wheel, and you get a new judge assigned. And at that point, it's done. So it kind of gives you the workaround to the game that they play when they sue us on these. So that just barely went into effect in January. So as we continue to move forward with legislating, we'll see how that kind of impacts the system. But if we had something like that in place with the abortion case or with some of these other cases, we would have been able to kick the judge as a matter of right to get a more neutral judge. And maybe it would have made a difference.
What do you think we're going to do now with the abortion stuff here in the state of Utah? I mean, what happens next? Are we just going to sit around and wait for the Supreme Court to pick it up, or is there anything that legislators can do about that?
So we can always go through and change the laws, but it gets really complicated when you have active litigation. And so we work closely with our attorneys who are working on these cases to try to figure out what points we can push on, what points we can't push on. I mean, we went after abortion clinic licensing, and we've gone after some other things. Abortions have to be in a hospital setting. Like, we've gone after some things, but we're a little bit stuck just because of that active litigation, and we're essentially being held hostage by the courts.
Is this John Pierce stepping down going to affect anything positively?
I honestly don't know. So I'm not an attorney. So I don't know the justices like some of the attorneys do, but I think that throughout this, I think the Senate has learned that they really need to pay close attention to who these appointments are. So as Justice Pierce exits the scene, I think that you're going to see a lot more consideration and a lot more questioning and deliberation for who fills that position, because we haven't always had this issue with an activist judiciary. You know, they used to do what they were supposed to do and just interpret for constitutionality, look at those sorts of things. And we've nationally moved away from that. And so anytime a judge steps down, it gives us an opportunity to move back in the direction that things are supposed to be. And I think the Senate is very, very aware of that. And I think that they're going to be very, very careful with who they put in that position. And I hope that it makes a difference.
Is there anything being done with defunding Planned Parenthood? Because I know the state funds University of Utah and a few other state agencies, and those agencies turn around and donate to Planned Parenthood and stuff like that. So there's all these in-runs to circumvent laws. Or is there anything being done about that?
Yeah, so I don't know all the ins and outs of who donates to who. I know there are some questions that come up around Pride Month with the parades every year. I know UTA's had some issues in the past. And we see some like quasi-governmental entities that donate and participate in these things. The question is like a yes and a no. So taxpayer funds cannot go to Planned Parenthood, but a lot of these organizations like the university also have private funds and endowments and things that are not taxpayer money that go in. And so they can do what they want with that pot of money. And so it's tied to the funding.
How do we know we're using that pot of money?
Well, we hope that our Higher Education Appropriations Committee does their job. And I know there have been some audit requests made in that area, and it's a point of consternation every single year when it comes up. But we don't have control over private funds. And so it's another one of those ones where it gets interesting. And even though we'd like to go do more, we do have some limits because the proper role of government gives us those limits. Yeah. So it gets interesting. But state taxpayer money is not allowed to go to Planned Parenthood.
Well, that I know, but I know there's a lot of people trying to circumvent that.
Well, and there are definitely loopholes. There are absolutely loopholes.
Well, let's go down to our last topic, which is the judges themselves. And this is a huge topic right now, not just in the state of Utah, but nationally. There's a lot of activist judges out there. And like you said, there's these organizations that know exactly which judges to bring stuff to stop everything that Trump's doing. I just did a kind of a standalone video this last week, just specifically talking about how many court cases there are that Trump's facing right now. There's over 181 of them, from his tariffs to the boys and girls sports and all that kind of stuff to Doge and everything Doge was doing. I mean, there's case after case after case that I went over this last week of just judges being activists now. We're facing the same problems here in Utah because that's how this abortion thing happened and all that. And there's several others that we try to get past that just tend to hit the courts. And it's where the judicial branch, again, it's just supposed to be interpreting the law and making sure it's constitutionally correct. And they're not supposed to be legislating from the bench, rehashing the laws out. And that seems like a lot of stuff what we're doing. Now, we had Carrie Ann Lisenby on here a couple weeks ago, and she was talking about passing a new law that would basically give instructions when judges come up for re-election on.
So we could track their
kind
their
of
track record
what they're doing, their track record and stuff like that. So we have no idea who to vote in and who to vote out.
Right.
And I think that would help. But I see there's a huge problem with our court system right now, and I don't see any solution coming up anytime soon. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I recently became the House Judiciary Chair. So this is what I get to spend the next year and a half of my life working on and talking about. And we have several working groups that are going through working on judicial accountability, transparency through the judicial process, the judicial retention evaluations that you were mentioning. All sorts of things. It's kind of everywhere, and we've got pages and pages of policy options. It's just which ones will actually get the job done and fix the problem, and we don't know the answer to that question yet. One of the
Because
things...
once you do fix the problem, it's going to hit the courts too.
Right. And, you know, we had a lot that we did this last session in the area of judicial accountability, and then the courts kicked the crap out of us for not staying in our lane. And, you know, turnaround was fair play, and they had 2 justices arrested within a month of session ending. And so we're like, yeah, that's why we needed more judicial accountability. But I think that a really good starting point is what Representative Lisenby was working on last year, and I know we're continuing to work down that path, is the voter education piece and changing how those evaluations are done. And there are some interesting things, like if a judge is coming up or is going to receive a negative review through that evaluation process, if they resign, the evaluation disappears, and they can actually go get hired on, so to speak, in a different district, and that negative action doesn't follow them because it was never completed. So there are a lot of ways to kind of get around that. Plus, you have colleagues and friends evaluating colleagues and friends, which we know sometimes isn't always great. And I know that the administrative office of the courts likes to try to catch problems early. They like to try to educate and address the issues. And they say that that's why the retention evaluations are always positive, is because they've been able to work with the judges through those issues. But I think there are just some biases that you can't work through. And I think when you need when you're supposed to have a non-biased judiciary, I think there are some people that should not be on the bench. But I mean, it kind of comes back to the legislature, because it was the Senate that confirmed them. And which again goes back to what I was talking about with, I think the Senate's going to be paying a lot closer attention to who they're putting on the bench now, because we've learned, yeah, actually your personal politics do matter with what your decisions are, and they're going to be looking for those biases a lot more. And I've talked to several senators on this, and I would say that advice and consent hearings are going to be a lot more interesting than they have been in the past. In the past, it's been like, oh, yeah, you've got a great track record. Like, sure, you could be a great judge. But that's not how it's playing out. And we have some very good judges in the state of Utah, some very, very good judges. And we also have some that we obviously know are not all that great. I mean, we've had 2 that were arrested this year. We had another one that blew up the media from making comments, and I don't know the full context of those comments about privilege that were made, so I can't speak to, the details of that situation. But the fact that we've actually had to go and arrest judges for breaking the law is not good. And we have a breakdown in trust. And we had a situation this last session where the judiciary and the legislative branches, they were fighting, but over accountability. And the legislature is pushing on accountability. And the judiciary was saying, actually, we'll just do it ourselves. And we know that when you police yourself, it's not necessarily the best way to do it. No. It doesn't mean it can't work. In a perfect society, it might work, but that's not how it works in real life. And so trying to find ways to take the politics out without taking the politics out, it's interesting and it's complicated, but we have some of our best minds on Capitol Hill working on it. And I think we're going to come up with something. I don't know what that's going to look like yet, and I doubt it fixes the problem altogether. I think it's going to be a multi-year solution, but they are working on it. And Representative Lisenby is absolutely one of those best minds when it comes to that topic. So. And
we're finding there's conservative judges that are not so conservative, because even on the Trump side of things, he's got some activist judges. 2 of them were Reagan appointees. Mm-hmm. One of them was a Bush appointee, and one of them he appointed himself. And they're causing the biggest problems. Here in the state of Utah, we have conservative judges appointed by our previous governors, who are decently conservative governors, and becoming very, very activist for some reason. And well, I actually don't know that I would say that we appoint conservative judges. Just because we've had a conservative administration hasn't translated to the justices being conservative. And I know that politics historically are something we've tried to keep out of the judiciary here in Utah, which has led to left-leaning judges being on the bench, because we've taken personal politics out of it. They've obviously gone and been reinserted through the judicial side, not through the legislative side.
But if we really wanted to make sure that we had conservative justices being appointed, the Senate during those hearings would have to actually look at the personal politics of the individual and not just their record within that system. And that's something that historically has not been done.
Hopefully they do that now, because
I think they're planning on it.
Obviously, it's very, very necessary at this point.
Yeah, I've talked to several members of that committee, and they're like, oh, yeah, we're looking. So I know that the lesson's been learned, and hopefully, they're able to work that out. As the House, we don't get an opinion on that.
Yeah,
so,
I'm looking forward to hearing some good news in the future.
Yeah, not from me.
Well, I think half the Trump agenda is not going to get done anytime soon because it's going to get stuck out in the courts. And I think that's exactly what the left wants to have happen, because they think they can just drag this thing out to the midterms, to the next election, and then none of these policies will actually take effect. And they can just roll it right on back, and as if nothing ever happened.
Yeah.
The same thing with our state abortion law. They're just going to drag it out, and
that's what they're doing.
Hopefully the next administration, just nothing ever happens, and you can't ever enforce it.
Yeah, that's what's happened so far. And that's why that rule we passed last year with being able to change judges and not allow those that are suing us to enjoin these laws to game the system in the way that they were is going to make a difference, because they can no longer guarantee a certain judge and a certain bias as part of these cases, because we as a state have the ability to boot that judge. And so it'll be interesting to see how it changes with that. I don't think we've been sued on policy since that took effect, but it's definitely a rule that we're aware of because we're the ones that put it into
It's
place.
still a lottery system, right? When you get flipped, it's still just a...
So it's not a true lottery, actually.
No.
There are presiding judges in each area, and they are the ones that are kind of responsible for caseload. Now, they're supposed to do it based on caseload, who's got availability, so it's supposed to function like a lottery. But there's no guarantee that it functions like a lottery, and that is one of the things that we're looking at and we're talking about as we work through this judicial accountability process, is how can we make case reassignment more lottery-like without...
Well, it's like sticking in a Powerball hopper, just picking out a judge, right?
Right. So, but that would make a difference, and we're hoping it does.
At least here in the state of Utah. So federally,
Yeah.
I have no idea what's going to happen there.
They're going to have to figure that one out themselves.
Yeah, it's how they've tried to stop things is incredible. And I did this in this video. I just did this last week. I'll just make a brief kind of reference to it. So what's essentially happening is, now that we have Congress, both houses, and we have the White House, the Democrats have lost the vast majority of their power, and that essentially freaks them out, because they just can't get anything done. Mm-hmm. But they've always had a backup, and the backup has always been deep state operatives, which is those deep state government employees, and they've always been able to manipulate money. They've been able to manipulate money out of Department of Education, Department of Defense, USAID, you name it. They've been able to move money and fund a lot of their programs. And so without legislation, without executive orders, without any proper government processes of any kind, they just slip these programs in through their deep state operatives and push the money around, and they can still get everything they want done.
Yeah, one of the things...
So what Trump's doing right now is, now he's trying to fire the deep state as quickly as possible. DOJ is eliminating all the funds, so now the Democrats don't have the White House, they don't have Congress, and they're on the point of losing their deep state and all the funds that go with it, and so everything they've done for the last 40, 50 years is almost going to get gone, and that is really freaking them out. So where all their power's gone, all their backups are gone, and so it's dragons out there now fighting to keep on to a semblance of any of that, and that's why the court systems are so backed up right now.
Yeah, well, and I think that one thing that's really important to what you just said is it's not with an act of Congress, right? These regulations are coming from the agencies. Funding is being tied to certain programs. You have to follow these requirements and these strings in order to access this federal funding, which is really just our own money being given back to us. And one of the things that we've been talking with the federal administration on, and the speaker has really been doing a great job at leading out on this. I was able to accompany him on one of the trips to DC. Several of us went out for RFK's press conference on banning food dyes, which was really a neat experience. But as part of that trip, we met with White House officials. And it was really, really neat because we talked to them about turning those things over to the state. If there's no act of Congress, it should belong to the state anyway. But it hasn't because of how all the red tape's been put into place. And the administration's actually been working with us and very responsive on a lot of these federal things that were done without an act of Congress, at giving them back and letting us do it. And so we've opened the door on that relationship and that level of collaboration with the administration. And they've been very responsive. And in fact, they want us to take it. They would rather us deal with it ourselves, which of course we would rather us deal with it ourselves also. And so I'm really excited to see what happens over the next few years as we start implementing these plans that we're currently in the process of coming up with. But Speaker Schultz has been great on, pushing that messaging and talking. And it was really neat to be able to be in those conversations at the White House with the people who make those decisions. And I think that it's going to be a lot of really good things coming back to Utah from that. And
It had to
hopefully,
have been an amazing conversation because, what other administration would have worked with you like that?
right. It's been seriously so cool. I mean, we had 3 cabinet members in Utah on the same day out working on different things and talking to us about different things. We had infrastructure, we had the EPA, we had HHS, all in Utah on the very same day. And for little old red Utah, who doesn't usually play on the national stage, we are punching hard. And
That's awesome.
We have an in with this administration that we have never had in the past. And it's so cool because we're able to actually go in and make these changes. And that meeting was so neat because it was us with our list of concerns saying, hey, we've had trouble with this. We submitted this waiver years ago. And they're like, great, forward it to us. We'll get it done. Bam. Or like, we did this. They're like, okay, yeah, we'll get that done. Give us 48 hours. Bam.
No kidding.
And the entire thing was just action, 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 action. And I had some concerns related to recent federal guidance that came out on how you work with transgender kids in foster care. And a lot of the things that we talked about that Oregon is doing in their schools, they put into federal statute or federal rules. And I brought those up and they're like, oh yeah, we totally know about it. We're already working on winding it back. We're doing X, Y, and Z. And it was very, very action oriented. You cannot fall asleep in that meeting or you miss 10 things. Like it was just bam, 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 bam. And everything that we said, hey, we need your help with this. They're like, great, done. And it was so cool. And then to have Utah be recognized on a national stage for so many different issues, we really are punching heavy right now. And it's super awesome to be part of it.
Well, I'm glad to see that because we should be the one state with our background and our heavy religious upbringing is the one state that we should be leading out on that. And I want to point real quick to some, hypocrisy between the Democrat Party and the Republican side of things is you've got, let's take the Department of Education, where they're, again, creating all these lines and sob stories about eliminating the Department of Education, that you're going to be eliminating all the funding, you're going to be eliminating all these programs. When they don't care about the programs, they don't care that these other departments can take up those programs. What they're freaked out about is they no longer have the carrot and the stick, right? They no longer can control it. If they don't have the money sitting there where they say, you, in order to get this money, you have to do this, this, and this, they lose their control.
Yeah.
And that's why they're freaked out about losing the Department of Education, is because now they can't force certain doctrine, they can't force certain education mandatory stuff onto our kids. They can't have any of that stuff because they can't tie it directly to money. You're going to get your money no matter what happens. Then when Trump goes around and does the same thing and says, look, I'm going to pull your federal funding if you don't abide by my executive orders in Title IX,
It gets blocked by the courts.
It gets blocked by the courts. And so it's the exact same thing they've been doing for years and holding funds back for the Department of Education, or like in the case of our own Governor Cox that we all don't like. He got so much funding for having a mask mandate and all this other kind of stuff, and then he forced out upon us just to get the funds. But it's again where the feds held that out and says you don't get these funds unless you do this, this, and this. And yet when Trump goes and does the exact same thing, he gets stopped by the courts, and everybody cries foul.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I'm so excited about. We're talking with them about ways where rather than sending our money to DC and them sending it back, us keeping it, implementing the programs. We know we can do it better. We talk about the Utah way. We really can do it better than the federal government can. We know Utah. We know what our people want. We know what we believe. We know what our problems are. So much better than anyone in Washington, D.C. And so rather than having to send that money up, we're talking about block grants and various things where we can just keep it and do the programs in our own way. And I mean, that gets rid of the red tape because we're no longer having to beg and meet their set of standards to get our own money back. We're just not giving it to them in the first place, and we're doing all these programs. Medicaid is one. There are so many different pieces of red tape within Medicaid. That's something that we're talking about doing ourselves. Like, let us run our programs. And the Trump administration is like, yeah, let's figure out how to make it happen. And so I'm really hoping that we can get rid of a lot of that just by being able to keep our own money. And again, if there's no act of Congress, we should be doing it anyway.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people don't understand that when we send money to Washington and they try to send it back, it always comes back with a set of requirements. You have to do this, this, and this. It's just the way it always works. And if you don't send the money up there, then there's no requirements. There's no mandates. So the only thing that Washington wants to do is control. They want to force things over the top of you and say, we know best here at Washington than the local state level, which is what the Department of Education is doing. BLM is doing it. There's a lot of stuff where they're mandating certain things. And the more power we can pull back from that, the more funds we can pull back, the less control they're going to have.
Yeah.
But everything that the Trump administration is doing right now can all be reversed on a dime in the next administration.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and so I hope Congress can get it together and put some of those protections in place while we have those majorities. I really do.
Yeah, and I don't see them acting very quickly.
Well, nothing. It's speed of government in general, but the bigger the government, the slower the speed.
Yeah.
We move pretty quick in Utah compared to the rest of the country.
I was just going to say that. We're doing quite well. We just got to make sure that we keep all this other stuff out. We're doing incredibly well right now. So any last thing you want to comment about that you're working on right now that we haven't discussed?
No, not really, actually. I mean, it's, for me, the next little bit really just looks like, what do we do as far as the judicial accountability stuff goes? I just became the chair about a month and a half ago, and so we're still trying to get up to speed.
Chair? How did that happen?
So the speaker appoints, and he did some shuffling when they made interim assignments, and so a couple of the chairs got moved around, and I moved from administrative rules to general oversight over to judiciary. And I've been serving on the Judiciary committee, so I'm familiar with the issues, but I haven't been involved to the same level as the chair of that committee would. And so it's getting up to speed and then trying to figure out how we can solve the problems here in Utah. We're still going to have the federal problems, but if we can at least make Utah function, maybe the rest of the country can look and see what we're doing and figure out their problems too.
That's exciting.
It's very exciting. It's very exciting to have you there in that position, because that is the one thing I think that is the most detrimental thing we're facing right now, is the activist judiciary that's really, really holding a lot of things up right now.
Yeah, and I've been in hours and hours and hours worth of meetings with the courts now, with fellow legislators. We're definitely working. We're not sitting on our hands when it comes to that issue. Again, we don't know what the right answer is going to be yet, but we have a lot of options and a lot of policy levers we could potentially pull. And we get hit a lot on, well, they're a separate branch. Yes, they are, but even constitutionally, here within our state constitution, we have the oversight, right? They were really upset that we looked at putting their grade essentially on the ballot. And they were super unhappy that we were meddling in retention elections. Retention elections constitutionally are directly under the authority of the legislature. And so, I mean, that is a lever that we constitutionally maintain ownership of. It's just that clash. And I think they realize some of that. I think we know what our options are. It's just the question of what can we get them to implement without legislative action? Where do we need legislative action? You know, where are our constitutional boundaries, and staying within all of that? Where are their constitutional boundaries, and just kind of figuring it all out. It's complicated, but we're moving in a direction.
Yeah, well,
hopefully it's a
they've
good
had
one.
unbridled power for so long, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to give that up. And then anything you guys do come up with is going to get fought out, and you're going to have to ask the very, very people that need to be regulated to self-regulate somewhat, and it's going to be a hard fight to figure out.
And that's why that collaboration with them as we work through this process is so important. On a lot of the bills that we ran last session related to judicial accountability, we compromised on many. Even the one that the governor ended up vetoing, we had compromised with the courts and come to a place of consensus. And I think you'll see that again, where we have the appointment of the Chief Justice, because the Chief Justice right now has to campaign to the fellow justices on the court. And that, again, brings politics back into an apolitical decision, or what should be an apolitical decision. And so trying to pull that out, but we have to work with them because it's exactly what you said. They are the ones that could be deciding whether what we do sticks or not. And so it's really a delicate balance, but we are trying.
I'm glad I know who to go to as things start getting put out into the media and things to go find out what the facts are on that. That's exciting.
Well, the last thing I really wanted to talk about today before we end the podcast is SB 54. SB 54 has been a lot of fun over the last 11 years. Nobody in the delegate world likes it. I know Congress, and your guys, the House portion of you guys have passed it several times, but it's kind of get blockaded in the Senate to get rid of that. We have a governor that's in office strictly because of SB 54 right now. We have one of our senators that is in office strictly because of SB 54, and there's a lot of issues running up with that. And it's making it so that the politicians and the political voices that are out there right now are not kind of true to what the people believe and have. Because, again, it comes down to a popularity contest and not to where someone has really been.
It's a different campaign experience, for sure.
Different campaign experience, because you don't have to have any money to run in the delegate format. All you have to do is just get out and get your word out there, right, and start visiting with delegates. On the other side, it's just money rules. And the more popular you are, the more your rules, because the general public, all they see is just commercials on TV, ad signs out in the freeway. And the more times they see something, the more likely they are just to vote for something, which is how Cox got in. So how are things been between the House and the Senate on trying to get that repealed?
Yeah, so this is going to be more of a political strategy consideration. I am not an SB 54 candidate. I've never filed an intention to gather signatures. I've been a delegate for a long time, but I also love some of my colleagues that do get signatures, right? So you look at it and you try to see both sides of the argument as you go through it. But one thing that you have to be really, really aware of on Capitol Hill is how much political capital you actually have, because you only have a certain amount and you have to use it strategically. And one of the things that we run into with SB 54 was if the House could pass it, and we might be able to right now, I think we're pretty close to a 50-50 split, the Senate right now will not pass it. If the Senate would pass it, then it would go to the governor, who will not sign it. So in order to override, you would need a 2/3 in the House and the Senate, neither of which we have at the moment. And so I know there's a lot of frustration that you guys aren't doing it. Introduce the bill. I'm going to vote for whoever introduces this bill. Like, okay, so you want your representative to go and spend all of their political capital on something that is currently dead on arrival.
We all realize that it's going to take another governor to get that in.
It's at minimum going to take a different governor. It's probably going to take changes in both the House and the Senate at this point.
Why do you think we have barely a 50-50 in the House? Because I understand the Senate. I understand the issues
Yeah.
that are over in the Senate, but why are we so weak in the House, do you think?
Well, so if you look at a lot of the races, there are a lot of incumbents who come in below their challengers. And we have a lot of incumbents that rely on signatures to get reelected. And there's also cultural challenges that come into it. We know as delegates that we are a culture in ourselves, right? And not everybody can thrive within that culture. And so those that can't will operate outside of that culture. And so you kind of see those different things all play out all together. So there's not one thing that makes it close. And I think we could. I think it would be tight, but I think we could pass it. But it's a combination of things. We've got representatives who there's nothing you could ever do to convince them to vote for something like that, because if they did, they'd be out of office. Or, maybe they believe that there should be multiple pathways to the ballot, because you have some of those too who just ideologically agree with it. So you've got a whole combination of people. It's one of the challenges and one of the blessings of being one of 75 in the House, because you always have all of the different perspectives. But it's always been interesting to me, and I talk to my delegates about this, because this is something that comes up every single cycle. Sure, I could run that bill. I'm going to get laughed out of the room in some of those rooms. So do you want me to do that, or do you want me to focus on areas where I can make a change and get the wins for the district?
We know that there's no way without a new governor, without replacing half the Senate, there's no way that's going to happen right now.
And so it's one of those things where it's like, idealistically, yes, but reality has to weigh in at some point. And I know there are a lot of people that are frustrated that we're not introducing those bills. Even some of those of us who have always been friends of the caucus, we're not introducing those bills. But that's the political strategy part of it coming into play. And that's why you have your representative, right? Their job is to go figure out what they can and cannot do and get the wins for you that they can. And sure, there are some things that messaging would be great on, but if we introduce that bill right now, it's going to get slaughtered. Absolutely slaughtered. And somebody is going to go blow all of their capital on a bill that may never make it out of rules. And so it's one of those things where you have to kind of pick your wins. And we've been doing a lot on election integrity. We just had Representative Burton's bill with going back to the in-person balloting, and we've been trying to make a lot of changes as far as that goes.
Another one of those was the signature verification, because even though they're collecting signatures, those need to be verified.
Signature verification,
And it's coming out that Cox didn't have the signatures, and nobody verified them.
And that's one of those things too, where it's like, okay, how do you work that, right? The person in charge said, yes, you bet the requirement. And so it turns out maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't really know.
That's on her.
So that wasn't a his fault issue. That was, the person that said, yes, check, you meet the requirement. And so it's like, all right, well, they've been told they were good. So even though they had weeks left to gather more, they didn't, because they were told they were good. So it's like, what do you do? And it creates the situation that we find ourselves in right now, where there's a lot of contention from all of the different sides. And we do the best we can. We push as much as we can. But I don't think it's prudent to blow all of our capital on a non-starter issue. And so it's not to say we're not monitoring the situation. We have these conversations regularly, and we always kind of got a little bit of a feel of how close are we. So we're watching, but the time is not right. Everything in life is context and timing, and it's not there right now. There's no way you get a 2/3 majority through both bodies required to override the governor. There's just no way. And so that's why we're not doing it. We'll take the wins that we can get. The base hits, we'll take those. But you're not going to get that full repeal at this point in time. And that's got a lot of people really frustrated and really upset. But it's the political reality that we've got to work with.
Yeah, I fully recognize that's a political reality, and hopefully a lot of people recognize it. I mean, that was a huge fight, obviously, between Lyman and Cox, and then again between Rob Axon and Lyman. I mean, that was center number one. But like you said, there's not much we can do without a new governor, which hopefully we'll get some next time, because it's our understanding he's not rerunning.
I haven't talked to him about it, so I don't know what his plans are.
Well, it's my understanding, and this is a maybe, that Chaffetz might be running, and Chaffetz would be a shoo-in because of his notoriety and popularity. I think he just have to put his name on his ballot and he could get elected in. He wouldn't even have to run much because everybody likes Chaffetz.
Yeah, there are a couple people that have been eyeing it and kind of looking at it and trying to figure out the landscape. And honestly, I'm just happy to not be one of them. I'm going to let them go deal with that.
Yeah.
I'll just stay in my little spot in the house and call it a day.
Well, very good. Well, we greatly appreciate you being on with us. I mean, this has been insightful. I hope it's been insightful for everybody out in the audience. And any last words, Ingrid?
I'm happy to know we have good people, good lawmakers in our
Thank you.
state, and there's a lot more good than there is bad, and makes me feel happy and hopeful for the future. And I'm really impressed with the work you're doing. And
Thank you. No, we don't always get everything we want, but I think that the people up there are generally trying to make a difference in the right direction. And sometimes we might disagree on what that is, but I think everybody up there at least has the intention of trying to do better from at least their own perspectives.
thank you so much, Stephanie.
Well, I'm grateful to everybody on board with God and Country. We'll have another Congresswoman in here next week. Look forward to 2 weeks from now. We're going to have Representative Mike Kennedy on himself. Again, that'll be 2 weeks from today. So thanks for being on board. We'll talk to everybody next week.
Bye-bye.
I can't see!